Two crowns sit on a stone table. One is marked with the red rose of Lancaster. The other carries the white rose of York. Both are royal. Both are ancient enough to speak the language of inheritance. Both are stained with the same family blood. That is the first horror of the Wars of the Roses. This was not a foreign invasion. It was not England defending itself from France, or Scotland, or some army beyond the sea. It was a royal family turning inward, sharpening its own genealogy into a weapon, and asking the country to bleed until one branch of the family tree could call itself legitimate. The question was simple enough to fit on a seal. Who had the right to wear the crown? But in 15th century England, a simple question could become a battlefield, because a crown was never just metal. It was land. It was offices. It was pardons, marriages, titles, confiscated estates, royal favor, and the right to decide which noble family would rise and which would be ruined. A king did not merely sit above politics. He was the door through which every ambitious man hoped to pass. And if the king was weak, absent, a child, or surrounded by enemies, then the door became a battlefield. By the time Englishmen began killing Englishmen under the Roses, the wound was already old. It had begun with a royal family too large to be safe. The Plantagenets had ruled England for centuries. They had produced warrior kings, failed kings, brilliant kings, disastrous kings, kings who conquered, kings who lost, kings who prayed, kings who punished. But their greatest danger was not that they produced too few heirs. They produced too many sons, too many branches, too many descendants of Edward III who could look at the throne and see not treason, but inheritance. On parchment, these claims could be arranged neatly. Names connected to names, marriages drawn with careful lines, descent traced through fathers, mothers, dukes, earls, dead princes, and forgotten agreements. In a royal archive, by candlelight, it might look like order. But parchment does not stop swords. On the 22nd May 1455, at St. Albans, that truth stepped into the street. The battle was not yet the giant slaughter people imagine when they hear the phrase civil war. It was shorter, smaller, more personal. Armed men moved through an English town. Retainers followed the banners of great lords. The king, Henry VI, was physically present, but presence was not the same as control. The Duke of York and his allies had come not as rebels in their own story, but as men who claimed they were rescuing the realm from bad counsel. Their enemies stood close to the king. That mattered. In this world, to control access to the king was to control the machinery of reward and punishment. A shopkeeper in St. Albans might not have cared about the fine points of Plantagenet descent. He might have cared about the sound of boots outside his shutters, the clatter of steel in a street that should have smelled of bread and horse dung, not fear. He might have known only that great men had brought their private wars into his town, and that by sunset the old rules would no longer feel safe. Blood was spilled, powerful men died, the king was taken into Yorkist hands, and England crossed a line. Not because one battle destroyed the kingdom. It did not. Courts still sat. Bells still rang. Farmers still ploughed fields. Ships still moved along the coast. London did not vanish into smoke, but something colder had happened. The nobles had learned that political disagreement could be settled by force, and then explained afterward as loyalty. That was the dangerous part. Every side in the Wars of the Roses would claim the language of order. No one wanted to appear as the villain of England. Yorkists would say they were saving the king from corrupt advisers. Lancastrians would say they were defending the rightful ruler and his son. Later, Edward IV would present himself as the strong king England needed. Later still, Richard III would claim he was protecting the realm from illegitimacy and dangerous factions. Everyone had an argument. Everyone had a grievance. Everyone had a version of loyalty that led through violence. And that is why this story is not simply York versus Lancaster, red versus white, hero versus villain. It is darker than that. It is the story of what happens when legitimacy becomes something powerful men can interpret for themselves. A weak king made the first crisis possible. Henry VI was not born to be a battlefield. He inherited one. He had become king as an infant in 1422, after the death of Henry V, the warrior king whose victories in France had made the Lancastrian crown appear almost blessed. But the son was not the father. Henry VI grew into a pious, gentle, unstable center of power, a man whose personal holiness could not repair military failure, financial strain, noble rivalry, or the humiliation of losing English lands in France. By 1453, England's position across the Channel had collapsed into disgrace. That same year, Henry VI suffered a severe mental breakdown. For months, the king could not perform the basic acts of kingship. He could not arbitrate. He could not command. He could not make the court feel whole. Into that silence stepped Richard, Duke of York. York was not some random rebel with an appetite for chaos. That would be too easy. He was royal. He had served the crown. He had a serious blood claim through the wider Plantagenet line. He also had enemies at court, and in a political world built on patronage, enemies near the king could become an existential danger. So the first shape of the conflict was not a council charging under roses. It was fear in a council chamber. Who had the king's ear? Who controlled appointments? Who would be blamed for the failures in France? Who would gain custody of royal authority when the king himself could not use it? And if one faction gained control, what would happen to the other? These questions do not look dramatic on a map. But they are how civil wars begin. They begin when losing office feels like losing protection. They begin when a rival's promotion feels like a future death sentence. They begin when law still exists, but trust no longer does. The Wars of the Roses would become famous for its great scenes of blood. Towton, where thousands may have died in snow and mud. Barnet, where fog and confusion helped decide a kingdom. Tewkesbury, where Lancastrian hope was crushed. Bosworth, where the last Plantagenet king was cut down and a Tudor exile took the crown. But before those fields, there was a more intimate violence. A family had stopped believing that family was enough. And once that belief broke, every child became a threat. Every brother became a possible traitor. Every uncle became a guardian, only until someone wondered whether he wanted more. That is why the Tower of London haunts this story. In 1483, nearly 3 decades after St. Albans, another child king entered the center of English politics. Edward V was 12 years old. His father, Edward IV, had died suddenly. The boy had the name, the blood, and the legal expectation of kingship. But he did not have control. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became the man with soldiers, allies, and physical access to the heir. The boy and his younger brother were placed in the Tower. At first, that did not automatically mean prison. The Tower was also a royal residence, part of the ceremonial path toward coronation. Then the coronation did not happen. The boys disappeared from public view. Richard became king. Historians still debate the exact fate of the princes in the Tower. The evidence is fragmentary, sharpened by later politics and poisoned by Tudor propaganda. But the political meaning is impossible to miss. By 1483, the struggle for the English crown had reached a point where children of royal blood were not merely heirs. They were obstacles. Imagine a guard in the Tower corridor at night, stone underfoot, a key heavy in his hand, the muffled sound of movement behind a door. He may not know whether he is guarding a future king, a prisoner, or a secret that will outlive everyone involved. That is the human scale of this war. Not only banners, not only battles, not only noble names arranged in family trees. A boy behind a locked door, a soldier freezing at Towton, a widow listening for news after Tewkesbury, a clerk writing an attainder that turns yesterday's lord into tomorrow's traitor. The Wars of the Roses turned government into a series of survival calculations. Noble families did not simply ask, "Who is rightful?" They asked, "Who will protect us if he wins? Who will punish us if he loses? Which badge should we wear when the wrong badge might cost us our land, our title, or our head?" That is why the war kept changing shape. At first, it looked like a struggle to control Henry VI. Then, it became a struggle over whether Richard of York should inherit after him. Then, it became the rise of Edward IV, a young warrior who took the throne by force and made victory look like legitimacy. Then it became a crisis inside the Yorkist family itself, as Warwick the Kingmaker turned against the king he had helped create. Then it became the mystery of the princes, the reign of Richard III, and finally the march of Henry Tudor from exile toward Bosworth Field. The names changed, the mechanism remained. When the crown could no longer command agreement, men tried to manufacture agreement with armies. And armies are poor judges of legitimacy. They can win a field, they can kill a rival, they can open a road to London. They can place a crown on a new head after the smoke clears. But they cannot erase memory. They cannot make every widow forgive. They cannot make every defeated family forget who took its lands. They cannot make a locked door in the Tower stop echoing. By 1485, when Richard III faced Henry Tudor at Bosworth, England had spent 30 years learning that royal blood could be less like a bond and more like a curse. The Plantagenets had not run out of claimants. They had run out of trust. And that is the central tragedy. The English crown did not break because nobody had a right to it. It broke because too many people did. Before we move deeper into the first wound, before the roses had fully become symbols, before Towton froze into legend, before the Tower swallowed 2 boys into historical darkness. Remember this: history does not begin with ruins. It begins with choices that once looked reasonable. A protector appointed to steady the realm, a queen defending her son, a duke demanding security, a council trying to govern around a king who could not govern himself. If you want more stories like this, where power is examined not as legend, but as a living system of fear, blood, law, and survival, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because the Wars of the Roses did not begin with 2 colored flowers. They began with an inheritance too heavy for one child king to carry. Before England had 2 roses, it had one family tree. Not a clean one, not a peaceful one. A long, crowded Plantagenet tree, heavy with dead kings, surviving cousins, widowed mothers, ambitious dukes, and claims that could sleep for generations before waking up with a sword in their hand. In a royal archive, it might have looked harmless, a roll of parchment, a clerk's knife, a candle burning low over names written in dark ink. Edward III at the top, his sons branching outward beneath him. Edward the Black Prince, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, Thomas of Woodstock. Lines of descent crossing through marriages, deaths, female inheritance, political convenience, and old promises no one had forgotten when forgetting became useful. To a modern eye, it looks like genealogy. To 15th century England, it was ammunition. Because the Wars of the Roses did not begin as an argument between red and white flowers. Those symbols came later, sharpened by memory and Tudor storytelling. The deeper conflict began with a question that had never fully healed after 1399. Could a king be removed? That year, Richard II was forced from the throne by Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, who became Henry IV. It was one of the most dangerous precedents in English political history. Henry IV did not simply inherit a peaceful crown from a dead king. He took power from a living one. He had reasons. Richard II had alienated powerful nobles, punished enemies, and ruled in ways many considered tyrannical. Henry Bolingbroke had support. He had royal blood. He had political momentum. But once the act was done, no explanation could completely hide the wound. A sacred office had been made removable. That did not mean every noble immediately dreamed of rebellion. England did not fall apart overnight. Henry IV ruled. His son, Henry V, would later become a military legend. The Lancastrian crown built its own story of legitimacy through victory, ceremony, law, and the practical fact that people obeyed it. For a while, victory did what genealogy could not. Henry V made Lancaster look chosen. At Agincourt in 1415, English arms seemed to transform the family's questionable beginning into destiny. A king who wins in France can make people forget many things. Soldiers returned with stories. Chroniclers found glory. Parliament could be asked for money in the language of triumph. The dynasty born from deposition wrapped itself in conquest. But conquest is a dangerous source of legitimacy. It must keep producing. When Henry V died in 1422, he left behind not a warrior, but an infant. Henry VI was only a baby when the crown passed to him. The image is almost too fragile for the weight placed upon it. A kingdom, a French inheritance, a royal mythology, and the unresolved memory of 1399 resting on a child who could not speak for himself. A baby can inherit a crown. He cannot govern a court. So government moved into the hands of councils, protectors, uncles, bishops, nobles, and administrators. On paper, this was normal. Medieval monarchy had procedures for minority rule. Men knew how to govern in the name of a child. But every minority government teaches ambitious men an important lesson. The king's authority can be used by those who stand near him. Access became power. A clerk in Westminster might see this in the smallest details. A petition brought to the right household. A seal pressed into wax. A grant copied onto parchment. A marriage approved. A pardon issued. None of it looked like civil war. It looked like government. Yet beneath each document was the same question. Whose hands were moving the king's authority? That question would haunt Henry VI's reign. The child grew older, but the habits formed around his weakness did not disappear. England had learned to be governed around him. Noble factions had learned that proximity to the crown could enrich one family and endanger another. The machinery of royal favor became a prize. And then France began to slip away. Henry V had left behind a dream of dual monarchy, England and France under Lancastrian rule. It was a magnificent claim and an expensive one. Holding land across the Channel required soldiers, money, ships, alliances, garrisons, and a constant willingness to keep paying for a war that did not, simply because the English king had a title. By the 1450s, that dream was collapsing. Normandy was lost in 1450. Gascony, long tied to the English crown, fell in 1453 after the Battle of Castillon. The old Plantagenet kingship for centuries was reduced to a wound in national pride and a shrinking list of excuses. The loss was not only military, it was political. Men had paid taxes for war. Noble families had invested reputations in command. Soldiers had crossed the Channel expecting wages, plunder, honor, or at least purpose. When the war failed, blame had to go somewhere. It rarely goes nowhere. In a village far from court, the collapse of France might arrive as rumor first. A market tale, a returning archer, a damaged piece of armor hung above a hearth, a tax demand that felt less glorious now that victory had vanished. The king's failures were not abstract. They traveled in unpaid wages, expensive bread, empty promises, and men who came home with mud from a foreign field still dried into their boots. At court, failure sharpened faction. If Henry VI had been a forceful ruler, he might have contained the anger. Not easily, perhaps, but visibly. He might have punished one faction, balanced another, chosen ministers with authority, or made his own will feared. But Henry was not that kind of king. He was pious, he was gentle. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. He had religious seriousness and personal humility. In another position, those qualities might have made him admirable without danger. On the throne, they were not enough. Kingship in 15th century England required more than moral innocence. It required the ability to frighten men who owned castles, retainers, armed households, and old grudges. It required the ability to make judgment feel final. Henry VI could not do that consistently. Then, in 1453, the centre simply gave way. The king suffered a severe mental collapse. For a time, he could not respond to events, could not perform royal functions, could not provide the minimum theatre of command. The timing could hardly have been worse. France had been lost. A royal heir, Prince Edward, had been born to Margaret of Anjou. The court was already divided by rivalry and suspicion, and into that vacancy came Richard, Duke of York. York's claim did not come from nowhere. Through his ancestry, especially the Mortimer line descending from Lionel of Antwerp, he possessed a powerful genealogical argument. Through Edmund of Langley, he was also directly tied to another son of Edward III. In the cold mathematics of blood, York could look at Lancaster and see a flaw. Lancaster had the crown. York had a claim that could question how Lancaster got it. For years, that difference could be managed so long as the Lancastrian king commanded enough respect. But a weak king changes the meaning of every rival. Richard of York was not merely a nobleman with royal blood. He became a possible answer to a question more and more people were afraid to ask aloud. What if the wrong branch was ruling? This was the inheritance that broke England. Not a simple rivalry between two houses, but a system in which deposition, minority rule, military failure, and bloodline ambiguity accumulated quietly until every political argument could be dragged back to the same old wound. The Lancastrians could say they had ruled for decades. The Yorkists could say time did not cleanse a stolen crown. The Lancastrians could point to Henry V's glory. The Yorkists could point to Henry VI's weakness. The Lancastrians had possession. The Yorkists had blood. and possession in a monarchy is powerful only when enough armed men agree to treat it as final. By the early 1450s, that agreement was becoming fragile. At Westminster, the forms still existed. Seals were still pressed, councils still met. Petitions were still heard. The king still had a body, a household, a chapel, a crown, and a queen fiercely determined to defend the future of her son. But underneath those rituals, the realm was learning to ask dangerous questions. If Henry VI could not rule, who should rule for him? If York ruled for him, would York ever give power back? If Prince Edward stood in the line of succession, what happened to York's claim? And if Lancaster's right came partly from the removal of Richard II, then what stopped another branch of the family from making the same argument in reverse? The tragedy is that no one needed to invent these questions. They were already inside the inheritance. Every council meeting carried them. Every faction whispered around them. Every armed retainer made them harder to ignore. The Wars of the Roses would later look like a storm of personalities. Margaret's ferocity, York's ambition, Warwick's arrogance, Edward IV's charisma, Richard III's fatal decision, Henry Tudor's patience. But those personalities moved through a structure already cracked. They did not create the entire crisis from nothing. They inherited it. And once Henry VI's authority weakened, once France was lost, once York could present himself not as a traitor but as a necessary protector, the old family tree stopped being a record of the past. It became a map of future violence. The next step would not be inevitable. History rarely moves like a machine. People still had choices. Compromise was attempted. Peace was performed. Nobles spoke the language of loyalty even while preparing for the possibility of force. But the shape of the danger was now visible. A king too weak to command. A queen too determined to surrender her son's future. A duke too royal to be ignored. A court too divided to trust itself. The inheritance had not yet become open war, but it had become something almost as dangerous. A political world where every man around the crown suspected that losing influence today might mean losing everything tomorrow. And when politics begins to feel like survival, the sword is never far away. In the next chapter, that sword enters the king's own household. Henry VI, the gentle center of the realm, will become the emptiness around which stronger wills begin to circle. Because England's problem was no longer only who had the best claim. It was whether the man wearing the crown could still make anyone afraid to challenge it. The king is kneeling in a chapel. Around him, candles burn with a soft religious light. The air smells of wax, stone, and old incense. Somewhere outside that quiet room, nobles are counting allies, servants are carrying messages through corridors, and men with armed followers are learning to speak of loyalty in a language that sounds very close to threat. Henry VI did not look like a man built to terrify England. That was the problem. He had the blood. He had the title. He had the sacred oil of kingship on his body. Since infancy, he had been surrounded by the rituals that told the realm who he was supposed to be. But kingship is not sustained by ritual alone. It needs judgment. It needs presence. It needs the ability to make powerful men stop before they go too far. Henry could not always do that. He was not a monster. He was not a tyrant. In many ways, he was almost the opposite. Pious, gentle, personally devout, drawn toward learning and religious foundations, Henry VI had qualities that might have made him admired as a monk, a patron, perhaps even a saintly figure in a quieter age. But England did not need a saint. It needed a king, and by the middle of the 15th century, the office of king had become brutally practical. A ruler had to manage noble rivalries, finance war, judge disputes, control patronage, protect royal authority, and persuade armed aristocrats that obedience was safer than defiance. He had to turn inheritance into command. Henry VI inherited the command. He struggled to perform it. The shadow of his father made the contrast worse. Henry V had died in 1422, but his memory still moved through English politics like a banner that refused to fall. Agincourt was not merely a battle. It was a political myth. It allowed the Lancastrian crown to tell England that God, victory, and royal blood had all spoken in its favor. The son inherited that myth without inheriting the man who had created it. A courtier looking at Henry VI might still see the child crowned before he could understand the weight of the ceremony. A boy surrounded by regents, uncles, bishops, and officials. A king whose authority had been used in his name long before he could use it himself. That mattered. When a monarch grows up inside government rather than above it, the men around him learn habits. They learn how to move petitions, how to secure grants, how to cultivate influence, how to wait for moments when the king's will is soft, absent, or guided by someone else. The machinery of government keeps working, but it starts to answer to hands that are not always royal. By the 1440s and early 1450s, Henry's court was not simply a place of ceremony. It was a battlefield of access. Great noblemen understood that whoever stood closest to the king could shape the distribution of favor. Offices, wardships, lands, pardons, marriages, military commands, and protection from enemies. These were not decorative prizes. They were survival. A grant of land could rescue a noble household from decline. A royal pardon could save a man from ruin. A marriage could bind two families into a power block. A military office could bring income, followers, and honor. To be excluded from the king's circle was not only humiliating. It could become dangerous. So Henry's weakness did not create ambition. It gave ambition a doorway. The failure in France made everything worse. England's continental possessions had been a source of pride, revenue, identity, and noble opportunity. But the long war was bleeding away. Normandy fell in 1450. Gascony, the old English foothold in the southwest of France, was effectively lost after the Battle of Castillon in 1453. The news did not arrive as an abstract change on a map. It arrived in households. A veteran might come back from across the channel with a torn cloak, unpaid wages, and a story no one wanted to hear. A town that had supplied men or money might learn that sacrifice had bought no lasting victory. A family that had sent a son into service might receive nothing but rumor. The language of glory became harder to speak when the land itself had been lost. Someone had to be blamed. In a stronger reign, blame could be managed. A forceful king might sacrifice a minister, reorganize command, punish a noble, call parliament with authority, or turn anger outward toward another campaign. Henry VI's court instead became a chamber where accusation thickened into faction. William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, had already fallen from power and been murdered in 1450 after years of resentment over policy and royal favor. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, became another focus of Yorkist hostility, closely associated in hostile eyes with the disasters of France and the court faction around the king. Richard, Duke of York, watched this world carefully. York was too important to ignore. He had royal blood, wealth, service, and a claim whose implications became more dangerous as Henry's authority weakened. He had held major responsibilities in France and Ireland. He had his own network of followers. He was not merely a critic of government. He was an alternative center of gravity. That is what made him frightening. A lesser man could be dismissed. A rebel without lineage could be condemned. But York could wrap political opposition in the language of royal service. He did not need to say, at first, that Henry should be replaced. He could say the king was badly advised. He could say the realm needed reform. He could say corrupt men had captured the crown's authority. That argument was powerful because it sounded loyal. It also pointed a blade at the men closest to Henry. Then came 1453. At some point after the collapse of English fortunes in France, Henry VI suffered a profound mental breakdown. The exact nature of his illness is impossible to diagnose with certainty across the centuries, and the evidence must be handled carefully. But politically, the consequence was clear. The king became unable to perform kingship. The center of the realm went silent. Imagine the court in that moment, the king's chamber no longer functioning as the engine of decision. Officials waiting for answers that do not come. Nobles measuring one another. The queen, Margaret of Anjou, surrounded by pressure and suspicion, now pregnant or newly tied to the future of a Lancastrian heir. Yorkist eyes fixed on the vacancy at the heart of government. This was not simply a medical crisis. It was a constitutional emergency without a clean constitution to solve it. Someone had to govern. Richard, Duke of York, became protector of the realm in 1454. On paper, the arrangement could be presented as practical. The king was incapacitated. The realm required administration. York had the rank and blood to serve. Government needed a hand strong enough to hold the seal, manage the council, and steady the machinery. But power taken in an emergency rarely returns unchanged. York's protectorate immediately threatened those who had depended on the previous court balance. Somerset was imprisoned. Yorkist influence rose. Men who had feared exclusion now tasted authority. Men who had enjoyed royal favor now learned what it meant to be vulnerable. In a corridor outside the council chamber, a minor official might not hear grand speeches about legitimacy. He would hear smaller sounds, a messenger summoned earlier than expected, a door closing before one lord could enter, a clerk instructed to prepare a warrant, the scrape of wax as seals were pressed onto orders that changed the fortunes of families. This is how government becomes personal. Not all at once. Not always with blood. Sometimes with paper. A name removed, a rival appointed. A prisoner transferred, a grant delayed. A household told that the king's pleasure now means something different because a different man stands near the king. York's enemies understood the danger. Margaret of Anjou understood it with particular clarity. For her, this was not an abstract question of reform. She had a son to protect, Edward of Westminster, born in 1453, the living future of the Lancastrian line. The birth of that child changed the emotional structure of the conflict. Before Prince Edward, York's position could be imagined as that of a senior royal cousin waiting behind a weak king. After Prince Edward, York's ambitions, fears, and claim stood in the shadow of a boy whose existence pushed him further from succession. To Margaret, York was not merely a useful administrator. He was a threat to her son. To York, Margaret's circle was not merely a rival faction. It was a threat to his survival. That is the kind of symmetry that makes compromise difficult. Each side can describe itself as defensive. Each side can point to a real danger. Each side can claim that if it does not act first, it may be destroyed later. When Henry VI recovered, the protectorate ended, but recovery did not restore trust. Somerset returned to favour. York and his allies saw the old enemies rising again around the king. Margaret's influence grew. The court did not become whole, it became sharper. Men who had briefly held authority now feared retaliation. Men who had been pushed aside wanted revenge. The king's return did not answer the central question. It made the question more urgent. Could Henry VI protect everyone from one another? The answer, increasingly, was no. And when a king cannot protect rival factions from each other, those factions begin protecting themselves. That is where the road to St. Albans begins. Not in sudden madness, not in a single evil plan, not in one ambitious duke waking up and deciding to destroy England. The road begins in the slow discovery that royal government no longer feels neutral. For York, the men around Henry looked like a danger to the realm and to himself. For Margaret, York looked like a danger to the royal inheritance. For nobles attached to either side, losing the struggle could mean ruin. For ordinary people, these calculations would soon arrive as armed retainers on roads, badges on coats, doors barred at dusk, and rumors that the king's peace no longer reached every town. Henry VI remained the anointed king, but anointment could not make him decisive. Piety could not make him feared. Gentleness could not make armed men trust one another. The rituals of monarchy still glowed around him, but the practical force of monarchy was leaking away into the hands of those who claimed to defend him. By 1455, England did not yet know it was entering a dynastic civil war. It knew only that the king was weak, the queen was vigilant, York was restless, Somerset was hated, Warwick was watching, and the court had become too crowded with men who believed their enemies were using Henry's name as a weapon. That is the tragedy of Henry VI's reign. He did not need to desire violence in order to make violence possible. A king can be personally innocent and politically disastrous at the same time. In the next chapter, the fear surrounding Henry will finally break into the open. The Duke of York will move not against the crown in theory, but against the men who stand beside it in practice. And in the streets of St. Albans, England will discover that once noble blood is spilled in the king's name, it becomes much harder to pretend the realm is still at peace. Richard of York did not enter history as a man openly reaching for the crown. He entered as a protector. That distinction mattered. In a kingdom still trying to believe in order, ambition had to dress carefully. A man could not simply declare that the king was weak, and therefore another royal branch should rule. That would sound like treason too early. But he could say the king was badly advised. He could say corrupt men had captured royal authority. He could say the realm needed cleansing, reform, and protection. Those words were safer. They were also dangerous, because in Henry VI's England, to protect the realm increasingly meant deciding who had access to the king. And once a man controlled access, he controlled the flow of power. Officers, pardons, land grants, military commands, and the quiet life or death business of royal favor. Richard, Duke of York, understood that world. He had served in France. He had governed in Ireland. He had blood close enough to the throne to make his loyalty valuable and his resentment terrifying. He was not an outsider pounding at the palace gate. He was family, which made him harder to dismiss and far more dangerous to exclude. To his supporters, York looked like the man England needed. Royal, experienced, wronged by corrupt favourites, capable of restoring order around a king who could not manage his own court. To his enemies, he looked like something else, a rival centre of monarchy. The crisis of Henry VI's mental collapse in 1453 had given York his opening. When York became protector of the realm in 1454, the arrangement could still be explained as service. The king was incapacitated. Government needed continuity. Someone had to hold the centre. But the protectorate did more than stabilize administration. It revealed who would lose if York gained power. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was imprisoned. Yorkist influence rose. The men who had feared Somerset's closeness to Henry VI now saw a chance to reverse the balance. For York's allies, the change looked like justice. For Somerset's circle, it looked like a purge waiting to become permanent. In a medieval court, this was not a minor inconvenience. A faction was not a debating club. It was a network of households, marriages, offices, debts, favours, armed retainers, and future expectations. When a great lord fell, the shock travelled downward. Servants lost protection. Lesser gentlemen lost patrons. Local rivals grew bold, and families who had tied their fortunes to the wrong man began to feel the floor tilt beneath them. This is how fear moved through politics, not always through speeches, often through appointments. A clerk might see it before a soldier did. One day, he copies an order under Somerset's influence. Later, another name appears. A warrant goes out. A grant is delayed. A household waits for news that does not come. The same royal seal remains on the document, but the hand behind it has changed. For a brief moment, York held the advantage. Then Henry VI recovered. The recovery should have healed the realm. In theory, the king's return to awareness meant the protectorate could end. Normal government could resume, and the dangerous question of who governed in Henry's name could be put away. But politics does not forget so obediently. Somerset returned to favour. Margaret of Anjou moved with greater urgency to defend the position of her husband and, more importantly, her son, Prince Edward. York and his allies watched the old court party regain ground and drew the obvious conclusion. If they allowed their enemies to dominate the king again, they might not merely lose influence. They might be destroyed. This was the narrowing corridor that led to St. Albans. Every side could claim fear. York could say he feared corrupt advisers would ruin the realm and destroy him. Margaret's circle could say it feared York would use reform as a road toward the succession. Somerset could fear Yorkist revenge. Warwick and Salisbury, York's powerful Neville allies, could fear their own regional enemies gaining royal support. The language was still loyal. The preparation was not. Armed men began moving under noble banners. Retainers gathered. Letters were sent. Messages passed through roads, towns, and households where ordinary people had little control over the great quarrels approaching them. By May 1455, Henry VI and his court were at St. Albans. The town was not built to become the opening wound of a dynastic war. It was a place of streets, doors, market habits, church bells, inn yards, and ordinary trades. Its people did not wake that morning intending to enter the mythology of England's royal collapse. But civil war often begins by invading ordinary spaces. A shopkeeper might have heard the rumours first. Armed lords nearby, the Duke of York approaching, Warwick with him, Salisbury too. Then the sound would become harder to dismiss. Horses, metal, raised voices. the hurried closing of shutters, the smell of sweat and leather pressing into narrow streets. Inside the town, Henry VI's side had men including Somerset, the figure Yorkists blamed for so much of the realm's failure. Outside, York and his allies demanded access to the king and the removal of their enemies. It was still possible, perhaps, to imagine negotiation, but only if both sides believed negotiation would not become a trap. That belief had already weakened. On the 22nd of May 1455, fighting broke out. The first Battle of St. Albans was not Towton. It was not a vast killing field under snow. It was short, sharp, and close. Men fought in streets and through barriers. Warwick's men forced their way into the town. The violence had the intimacy of a political assassination stretched into a battle. Somerset was killed. Other leading Lancastrian nobles died. Henry VI was wounded, though not fatally, and fell into Yorkist hands. That last fact mattered more than any official explanation. York could still say he was loyal to the king. He could still claim he had only removed evil counsellors. But after St. Albans, everyone understood something had changed. The king's person had been captured through force. And once that happened, the old boundary between loyal correction and armed coercion became almost impossible to see. York's victory solved his immediate problem. His enemies at court had been struck down. Somerset, the hated rival, was gone. The Yorkist lords had shown they could not be politically erased without a fight. For a moment, force had worked. That was precisely why it was so dangerous. Violence had entered the political system and returned with rewards. A nobleman watching from the side could learn the lesson quickly. If royal favor threatens you, gather men. If the council refuses you, march. If your enemies stand near the king, insist that your quarrel is not with the king himself, but with those who misuse his name. That formula would be used again and again. St. Albans did not immediately turn England into a battlefield from coast to coast. There were attempts at reconciliation. There were ceremonies of peace. Henry VI, still the anointed king, remained central to the official language of government. The realm did not yet admit that it had crossed into something larger. But memory had changed sides. The Lancastrian party would remember noble blood spilled in the king's presence. Margaret of Anjou would remember that York's claim of loyalty had ended with her allies dead and her husband in Yorkist control. Yorkists would remember that armed action had saved them from political destruction. Each memory justified the next preparation. In the streets of St. Albans, the Wars of the Roses found their first grammar. Strike first, explain afterward, and call it loyalty if the king survives in your custody. For Henry VI, the battle exposed the tragedy of his kingship more brutally than any illness could. He was not the architect of the violence. He did not command it with fierce purpose. Yet men fought around him, through him, and over him. His body remained sacred, but his authority could be seized by whoever controlled the space around that body. For York, St. Albans was both victory and trap. It proved he could challenge the court. It proved he had allies strong enough to force a reckoning. It removed Somerset and placed York again in a position of influence. But it also made him impossible to trust. To Margaret, York was no longer simply an over-mighty cousin demanding reform. He was the man whose road to influence had passed through the blood of the king's friends. To the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, York's rise was a shadow over the future. To nobles across England, the choice was becoming sharper. Attach yourself to a faction early, or risk being judged by whichever faction wins. A protector had become a threat. Not because he abandoned the language of loyalty, because he learned that loyalty could be spoken with soldiers behind it. After St. Albans, peace still had a face. There would be processions, councils, formal reconciliations, and public gestures meant to show that the realm remained one body under one king. But beneath those gestures, the families involved were counting losses and measuring revenge. The first blood had not ended the crisis. It had taught England how the next crisis might be fought. In the next chapter, the conflict will harden around the one person who made compromise nearly impossible. A child. Prince Edward of Lancaster was not old enough to command armies, govern councils, or understand every calculation made around his name. But his existence changed everything. Because once the Queen saw York not merely as a rival minister but as a danger to her son's inheritance, the struggle for access to Henry VI became something far more ruthless. It became a struggle over the future itself. A child can make peace impossible. Not because the child commands armies, not because he understands councils, treaties, or the old arguments of royal descent. A child may do nothing more than breathe in a nursery, be carried through a palace, or appear in a prayer beside his mother. But in a monarchy, a child can become the future made flesh. For Margaret of Anjou, that child was Prince Edward. Born in 1453, Edward of Westminster was the son of Henry VI and Margaret, the Lancastrian heir, the boy whose existence gave the Queen's cause a human centre. He was not merely a name in the succession. He was her answer to every Yorkist calculation. As long as he lived, the crown had a direct Lancastrian future. And that meant Richard of York was no longer only a rival around the king. He was a threat to the child. This is where the Wars of the Roses hardened. Before Prince Edward became central to the struggle, politics could still pretend it was about government. Who advised Henry VI? Who mismanaged France? Who abused royal favor? Who should hold office while the king could not rule effectively? Those were dangerous questions, but they could be disguised as reform. Succession was different. Succession asked who would inherit England after Henry died. It asked whose children would be safe, whose households would rise, whose enemies would be punished, and whose version of royal blood would become law. Once that question moved to the center, compromise became much harder to perform. Because to compromise with York might mean cutting Margaret's son out of the future. And no mother, no queen, no political faction built around a living prince could accept that quietly. Margaret of Anjou has often been treated as a convenient villain, foreign, fierce, unnatural, too forceful for the wife of a gentle king. Later writers had reasons to sharpen her into a monster. English political memory has not always been generous to women who exercised power openly. The truth is more complicated. Margaret was ruthless because the situation rewarded ruthlessness. She was feared because she had something to lose. Her husband's authority was weak. Her son's inheritance was contested. And the men who spoke of reform had already used armed force at St. Albans. If she misread York, her child could be politically erased. If she trusted too easily, she might deliver the future of Lancaster into the hands of its strongest rival. So she did what many rulers do when law feels unsafe. She looked for force. After St. Albans, the realm did not collapse immediately. There were attempts to restore calm. Henry VI remained king. York and his allies could still present themselves as loyal men who had removed bad councillors rather than attacked monarchy itself. But Margaret did not have the luxury of hearing only the official explanation. She could read the bodies. Somerset was dead. Other Lancastrian nobles had fallen. The king had been taken. Yorkist power had been proved by violence. If the Queen allowed that lesson to stand unanswered, then every future dispute could end the same way, with Yorkists marching under the language of protection while Lancastrian men died near the king. The court tried to look whole. Underneath, it was dividing. By 1459, the fragile peace was breaking apart. The Yorkist lords, Richard of York, the Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had become too dangerous to ignore and too powerful to crush easily. Their private affinities, retainers, and regional connections gave them a military weight that royal command alone could not dissolve. England was still formally one kingdom, but politically it was beginning to move like a country with rival centers of gravity. For the men below the great lords, this meant choices that were rarely free. A retainer did not sit in a chamber and weigh constitutional theory. He received a summons. He knew the badge he wore. He knew which lord fed his household, protected his lease, recommended his son, settled his quarrels, or stood between him and local enemies. A man might tighten a belt over a wool tunic, kiss his wife goodbye in the yard, and follow a banner because refusing the call of a patron could be as dangerous as facing the enemy. The War of Roses was built from thousands of such obligations. It was not only royal blood that moved armies. It was debt, dependence, fear, and habit. At Blore Heath in September 1459, violence returned. Salisbury's Yorkist force defeated a Lancastrian army in Staffordshire. It was not yet the final crisis, but it showed that St. Albans had not been an isolated sickness. The disease had spread into the roads and fields. Then came Ludford Bridge. In October 1459, the Yorkists gathered near Ludlow, but the confrontation collapsed against them. Calais troops under Andrew Trollope defected from the Yorkist side, and the morale of York's force broke. York fled to Ireland. Warwick, Salisbury, and York's son Edward fled to Calais. For Margaret's side, this looked like vindication. The Yorkists could be treated not as loyal reformers, but as traitors. At the Parliament of Coventry, sometimes remembered by Yorkists as the Parliament of Devils, attainders were passed against them. Titles and rights could be stripped away by law. The royal state, for once, seemed ready to answer force with legal destruction. But attainder is a dangerous weapon in a divided realm. It does not merely punish men. It tells them they have nothing left to lose. If York and his allies had feared political exclusion before, they now faced formal ruin. The law had narrowed their options. Exile did not end their cause. It hardened it. Calais, still a crucial English possession, became a Yorkist base. From there, Warwick and the others could maintain military power, gather ships, and prepare to return. Margaret and the Lancastrian court had tried to destroy the Yorkist threat through legality. Instead, they helped make rebellion feel like survival. In 1460, the Yorkists came back. At Northampton on the 10th of July, Warwick and his allies defeated the royal army. Henry VI was captured again. The pattern from St. Albans returned, but on a larger and more frightening scale. The king alive, the king honored in language, the king physically controlled by the men claiming to save him. A crown in captivity is still a crown, but it no longer frightens the men holding the keys. After Northampton, Richard of York made his most dangerous move. He did not merely demand the removal of enemies. He advanced his claim to the throne itself. This was the moment when the mask of reform slipped. York entered the political stage not just as protector, not just as critic, not just as the wronged royal cousin, but as a man who believed his blood gave him a superior right. The argument had always been there, waiting in the family tree. Now it stepped into the open. But England was not ready simply to replace Henry VI with York. The result was the Act of Accord in October 1460. On paper, it was a compromise. Henry VI would remain king for life. Richard of York would be recognized as his heir. After Henry's death, the crown would pass not to Prince Edward, but to York and his descendants. It was elegant in the way political documents can be elegant when they ignore human reality. Because the Act of Accord did not solve the crisis. It declared war on a child. Prince Edward, the son of the anointed king and queen, was disinherited. Margaret of Anjou was expected to accept that her son's future had been negotiated away by men who had captured her husband and used Parliament to redirect inheritance. There are moments in history when compromise looks moderate only to those who do not have to pay its price. For York, the Act of Accord was a triumph delayed. He did not get the crown immediately, but he secured the next best thing. Recognition that his line would follow Henry VI. For the Yorkists, this could be presented as legal settlement, not usurpation. For Margaret, it was theft dressed in parchment. Imagine the document itself. Wax seal, formal script, legal phrases, names arranged with calm authority. Then imagine what it meant in the Queen's chamber. A boy's inheritance reduced to a problem solved by men. A mother told that stability required her child's exclusion. A royal line asked to consent to its own future disappearance. No ceremony could make that acceptable. Margaret refused, and with that refusal, the war changed again. The conflict was no longer mainly over who controlled Henry VI. It was now over whether Henry's own son had been pushed out of history before he was old enough to fight for himself. Lancastrian resistance gathered in the north. York moved to confront it. In December 1460, he marched towards Sandal Castle near Wakefield. The exact decisions and tactical circumstances remain debated, and later accounts shaped the story with political memory. But the outcome is clear. On the 30th of December 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, Richard, Duke of York, was killed. The man who had almost turned a protectorate into a path to the crown died before he could wear it. For Margaret's cause, Wakefield was a savage restoration of possibility. The rival claimant was dead. Yorkist ambition had been struck at the head. The Act of Accord, already rejected by force, now seemed answerable by blood. But killing Richard of York did not kill Yorkism. It passed the claim to his son. Edward, Earl of March, was young, tall, charismatic, militarily capable, and now bound to his father's cause by something more potent than legal descent. He inherited not only a claim, but a death to avenge. This is one of the cruel mechanisms of dynastic war. A battlefield can remove a rival and create a martyr in the same hour. Margaret had defended her son's inheritance. York had died reaching for another future. The Act of Accord had failed to reconcile bloodlines because it asked one living child to vanish from the succession so another branch could wait its turn. After Wakefield, waiting was over. The next struggle would be fought by heirs. Not only Henry VI and Richard of York, the broken king and the dead protector, but their sons, Prince Edward of Lancaster and Edward of York, Earl of March. One boy carried the Lancastrian future. The other carried Yorkist revenge. England was no longer drifting towards civil war. It was inside it, and in the next chapter, the conflict will leave the chambers of argument and become something colder, wider, and more terrible. At Towton, under a freezing sky, Englishmen will kill Englishmen in numbers that later generations could barely comprehend. The crown will not be debated there. It will be taken from the snow. The crown was no longer waiting in a council chamber. It was lying somewhere beyond the snow. By the opening months of 1461, the Wars of the Roses had changed shape. The struggle was no longer only about advisors, protectors, councils, or the formal language of reform. Richard, Duke of York, was dead. The Act of Accord had failed. Margaret of Anjou had refused to let her son be erased, and the Yorkist claim had passed into younger, harder hands. Edward, Earl of March, was only in his late teens when his father died at Wakefield. But he was not a fragile heir hidden behind curtains and ceremony. He was tall, forceful, physically impressive, and already learning the most brutal lesson of his age. In England, a man with royal blood might still need to win his inheritance with bodies. His father had nearly reached the crown through law. Edward would reach for it through war. Wakefield had been meant to crush Yorkist ambition. In one sense, it did. Richard of York was killed on the 30th of December 1460. His son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, also died. The Yorkist leadership suffered a terrible blow, and the Lancastrians could believe that they had cut down the man who threatened Prince Edward's future. But dynastic war has a habit of turning death into fuel. A dead claimant can become more useful than a living negotiator. Richard of York, alive, had been a complicated political figure. Protector, rival, reformer, claimant, threat. Richard of York, dead, became something simpler for his followers. He became proof that compromise had failed. Proof that Lancaster would not share power. Proof that the claim must now be carried forward by a son whose grief could be turned into legitimacy. That son was Edward. At Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, Edward faced a Lancastrian force in the Welsh marches. The battle would later be remembered partly through the strange story of a parhelion. 3 suns appearing in the sky, which Edward supposedly used as a sign of divine favor. The details belong partly to the world of battlefield memory and political symbolism, but the meaning is clear enough. Edward needed more than victory. He needed victory to look ordained. In a civil war, killing enemies is not sufficient. A claimant must convince followers that bloodshed is not rebellion but justice. If the sky itself could be made to seem Yorkist, then the young Earl of March was not simply avenging his father. He was stepping into a story larger than private revenge. Mortimer's Cross gave him that story. Edward won. The victory mattered because it did something Wakefield had not managed to prevent. It proved that the Yorkist cause still had a battlefield future. The father was dead, but the son could command. The claim had not been buried. It had found a warrior. Yet victory in the West did not mean the road was clear. Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian army were moving south. In February 1461, at the Second Battle of St. Albans, the Lancastrians defeated Warwick and recovered Henry VI from Yorkist control. For Margaret's side, this was a reversal of the humiliation that had haunted them since the First St. Albans. The king once again was in Lancastrian hands, but possession of Henry VI did not solve the deeper problem. The capital mattered. London was not merely a city. It was money, legitimacy, merchants, gates, rumour, and the symbolic heart of political recognition. A king might have sacred oil on his body, but if London would not welcome the army around him, the meaning of kingship became uncertain. Margaret's northern army carried fear ahead of it. Whether every accusation was fair is less important than the political effect. Londoners heard stories of disorder, plunder, and vengeance. In a city of shops, warehouses, churches, apprentices, guilds, and merchants who depended on stability, the thought of an uncontrolled army was terrifying. A cloth merchant near Cheapside might not care whether Lionel of Antwerp or John of Gaunt produced the better claim. He would care if soldiers entered the city hungry. He would care if bolts of wool vanished from his storehouse, if coins stopped moving, if customers disappeared behind barred doors. To him, legitimacy had a practical measure. Which side could keep the streets safe? In that question, Edward had an opening. The young Yorkist heir moved toward London not simply as a grieving son, but as an alternative to fear. Warwick and the Yorkist leadership understood that the city's support could transform military promise into royal authority. By early March, Edward entered the capital. On the 4th of March 1461, he was proclaimed king as Edward IV. This was a staggering act. Henry VI was still alive. Prince Edward of Lancaster was still alive. Margaret of Anjou had not surrendered. The Lancastrian line had not vanished. Yet Edward of York now claimed the crown not as a future heir under an accord, but as king in the present. The logic had shifted. If Henry VI could not protect the realm, if his advisers had destroyed good government, if the Lancastrian claim had led England into humiliation and disorder, then Yorkists could argue that the crown had already morally failed in Henry's hands. But an argument proclaimed in London still had to be defended on the field. That field was Towton, Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461. The place was near the village of Towton in Yorkshire, in the cold north, where the road toward control of the kingdom narrowed into mud, wind, and killing. Later tradition would remember the battle as one of the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. Exact numbers remain uncertain, and medieval casualty figures must be treated with caution. But no careful historian needs an exact number to understand the scale of the shock. Towton was slaughter. Imagine the weather first. Not sunshine on bright banners, not clean heraldry against a summer field. Cold wind, driving snow, wet wool, men stamping their feet in mud, breath visible, fingers stiff around weapons. Archers trying to keep strings usable in miserable air, armor cold against skin, horses restless under the noise of thousands waiting to be ordered forward. This was not the romance of knighthood. It was a family argument enlarged until it required mass graves. The Yorkist army, under Edward IV and Warwick, faced the Lancastrian forces loyal to Henry VI, Margaret, and their son. The king himself was not the active battlefield force in the way a Henry V might have been. The moral and political weight of Lancasters stood behind the army. But the war was now being fought by men who had become accustomed to seeing royal names as reasons to kill. At Towton, the question of who deserved the crown was no longer abstract. It was pressed into ribs by spear points. The battle unfolded under terrible conditions. Accounts emphasize the wind and snow, and the weather became part of the legend because it seemed to give physical form to the cruelty of the day. Arrows disappeared into the storm. Men advanced into poor visibility. Lines met. The fighting became close, exhausting, and prolonged. A bowman in that storm might have known almost nothing of the high politics that placed him there. He may have known his lord's badge. He may have known that failure meant danger for his household. He may have heard that the other side were traitors, or usurpers, or murderers, or enemies of the true king. But when snow blows into a man's eyes and the ground beneath him turns slick, ideology becomes simple. Stand, strike, do not fall. That is the human cost hidden beneath dynastic language. The men who died at Towton did not all die because they had studied royal descent. They died because lordship, obligation, fear, payment, local rivalry, and political pressure had carried them into a field where retreat could be fatal, and mercy was difficult to recognize. For hours, the killing continued. The Yorkists eventually prevailed. Lancastrian resistance broke. The retreat became disastrous, especially near the crossings and routes away from the field. The defeated were pursued. Bodies accumulated not as symbols but as physical evidence that England had entered a new depth of violence. Edward IV had won. That sentence is simple. Its consequences were not. Towton gave Edward the military foundation his kingship needed. After the battle, the Lancastrian regime could no longer pretend that Edward was merely a rebellious claimant. He had defeated the forces of Henry VI in a massive confrontation. He held London. He had battlefield legitimacy. He had momentum. Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and Prince Edward fled north and eventually sought safety beyond the immediate reach of Yorkist power. Scotland became a refuge and a bargaining space. The Lancastrian cause survived, but it had been driven from the centre. For Edward, victory made kingship possible. It did not make kingship clean. A crown won at Towton carried the memory of Towton with it. Families across England had lost sons, fathers, brothers, servants, patrons. Noble houses had chosen sides. Lands would be confiscated. Titles would be punished or rewarded. The legal machinery of victory, attainders, grants, restorations, pardons, would now begin sorting the living according to the outcome of the dead. This is why civil war does not end when a battle ends. The battlefield decides who can command the next document. After Towton, Edward IV could use the institutions of monarchy to transform military success into government. His enemies could be declared traitors. Their lands could be taken. His supporters could be rewarded. The Yorkist victory could be written into law, ceremony, and administration. But that process created new wounds. Every confiscation made a memory. Every reward created jealousy. Every pardon raised the question of whether mercy was wise or foolish. Every surviving Lancastrian had to decide whether to submit, wait, flee, or dream of reversal. Edward had taken the crown. Now he had to make people live under the fact that he had taken it. That required more than youth and height, more than battlefield courage, more than the white rose. It required the careful management of men who had helped him win and would expect to be paid in influence. It required suppressing Lancastrian resistance without creating endless martyrs. It required convincing London, Parliament, nobles, towns, and local communities that Yorkist rule was not a temporary military occupation, but the new normal. And it required one more thing. Edward had to be a stronger king than Henry VI. In 1461, he looked like exactly that. Where Henry had been passive, Edward was active. Where Henry had been fragile, Edward was physically commanding. Where Henry had inherited glory from his father, Edward had seized it for himself. At Towton, he became the kind of king men could fear. Fear can build a throne quickly. Trust takes longer. For the moment, Edward had enough. He had London. He had victory. He had Warwick, Salisbury's son, the great Earl of Warwick, whose resources and influence had helped make Yorkist success possible. He had the aura of a young ruler who had survived disaster and avenged his father. But inside that success lay the next danger. The men who make a king do not always remain content to be his servants. Warwick had not fought simply to watch power pass away from him. Great noble allies expected gratitude, consultation, and influence. The Nevilles had invested blood and risk in the Yorkist cause. They had helped Edward climb over the ruins of Lancaster. And like all kingmakers, Warwick would eventually face the question that destroys kingmakers. What happens when the king you made begins making decisions without you? For now, that question waited. The field at Towton was still fresh. The snow in memory had not yet melted. Edward IV stood at the beginning of a reign that seemed to answer England's longing for decisive rule. The weak centre had been replaced by a warrior, but the Wars of the Roses had already taught England a bitter lesson. A battle can settle who wins today. It cannot guarantee who stays loyal tomorrow. In the next chapter, Edward IV will discover that the most dangerous threat to his throne may not come from the defeated Lancastrians first, but from within the Yorkist victory itself. A secret marriage, a proud nobleman, and a queen from the Woodville family will begin to fracture the alliance that had carried him through blood and snow. Towton gave Edward a crown. It did not give him obedience without conditions. The next crisis began not with a battlefield, but with a wedding. Not a grand royal wedding staged before ambassadors, bishops, nobles, and foreign envoys. Not a ceremony designed to bind kingdoms together under the eyes of Europe. This one was quieter, more private, and precisely because of that, more dangerous. Edward IV, the young Yorkist king who had won his crown through blood and snow, secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. The year was 1464. On the surface, it looked almost personal. A king, young and powerful, choosing a woman for himself. Elizabeth was a widow, the daughter of Richard Woodville and the widow of Sir John Grey, who had fought on the Lancastrian side and died before Edward became secure. She was not a foreign princess. She did not bring France, Burgundy, Castile, or Scotland as part of a diplomatic bargain. She brought something more intimate, a family, and that family would change the politics of Edward's reign. For a king, marriage was never merely marriage. It was diplomacy. It was patronage. It was access to the royal body, the royal household, future heirs, and the distribution of favor. A queen did not arrive alone. She brought brothers, sisters, parents, sons, daughters, cousins, ambitions, marriages to arrange, offices to seek, and enemies who would resent every step of her family's rise. Edward may have thought he was choosing a wife. The nobility saw him creating a faction. No one saw this more clearly than Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick had not become known as the Kingmaker by accident. His wealth, retainers, lands, offices, and control of Calais made him one of the most powerful men in England. He had helped Edward survive the collapse after Wakefield. He had helped the Yorkist cause recover. He had stood beside the young king through the violence that made Edward IV possible. Men like Warwick did not think of themselves as ordinary subjects. They thought in terms of partnership, obligation, and influence. To Warwick, Edward's marriage was more than a romantic insult. It damaged policy, Warwick had been negotiating toward a French marriage alliance for Edward. A royal marriage abroad could have strengthened England's position and elevated Warwick's own diplomatic role. Instead, Edward had married secretly, without consulting the magnate who had invested so much in his kingship. The message was unmistakable. Edward was not Warwick's creation anymore. That was the wound. In a candlelit room somewhere near the center of power, a courtier might have understood the shift before the chronicles fully named it. 1 week, petitions and favors moved through the old Yorkist channels. Warwick's name carried weight. Neville connections mattered. The men who had fought for Edward expected the machinery of reward to respect their sacrifice. Then new faces began appearing closer to the king. Woodville faces. A brother receiving advantage. A sister married upward. A father raised in honor. A young relative placed where an older noble family had expected its own chance. Nothing needed to be illegal to become intolerable. Patronage is most dangerous when it feels like replacement. The Woodvilles rose quickly. Elizabeth's family gained marriages into the nobility, offices, and proximity to the king. To Edward, this may have looked like the normal strengthening of a queen's kin. To older aristocratic families, especially those who had risked their lives for Yorkist victory, it looked like the sudden arrival of outsiders at the feast. The battlefield had been won by men in armor. The rewards were now being shared at court. That imbalance created resentment. Edward IV was not Henry VI. He was decisive, physically commanding, confident, capable of violence when necessary. He had the quality Henry lacked, the ability to make kingship feel active. But strong kings can create different dangers from weak ones. A weak king lets factions fight around him. A strong king may humiliate the men who expect to guide him. Edward's secret marriage told Warwick that the young king had a will of his own. That might sound like a virtue. In monarchic theory, it was. A king should not be ruled by the subject who made him king. But in the practical world of 15th century politics, kingship had debts. Warwick believed Edward owed him more than gratitude. He owed him consultation. He owed him strategic alignment. He owed him the kind of respect due to a man whose resources had helped turn a claimant into a ruler. Edward increasingly disagreed. This was not merely a clash of personalities. It exposed the central weakness of Yorkist victory after Towton. Edward had won the crown through noble support, but now he had to rule as more than the head of a coalition. He had to become the source of authority rather than the beneficiary of other men's power. The men who raise a king often discover too late that a real king must eventually lower them. Warwick did not accept that easily. His discontent found a royal partner in George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's younger brother. Clarence had Plantagenet blood, ambition, and the dangerous position of a royal sibling close enough to imagine alternatives. In a dynasty scarred by civil war, a king's brother was never simply a brother. He was a possible claim. Warwick married his daughter Isabel Neville to Clarence in 1469, against Edward's wishes. The marriage was a political signal as much as a family arrangement. It joined Warwick's overmighty influence to a prince of the blood. It offered a rival Yorkist centre, not Lancastrian, not foreign, but born from inside Edward's own house. This is how the Wars of the Roses kept mutating. Lancaster had been defeated at Towton, but the logic of the conflict survived inside York. Once royal blood had been taught to think in terms of armed alternatives, the habit did not vanish when the colour of the ruling rose changed. Edward had taken the throne from Henry VI. Now his own brother could imagine a future beyond Edward. The rebellion of 1469 revealed how fragile the settlement still was. Warwick and Clarence moved against Edward's government. The immediate grievances involved royal favour, Woodville advancement, regional politics, and Warwick's declining influence. But underneath them was the larger issue: who controlled the Yorkist state? Edward had become king. Warwick still wanted to define what that meant. At Edgecote in July 1469, forces associated with Warwick's rising defeated royal troops. The aftermath was brutal. Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, Elizabeth's father, and one of her brothers, John Woodville, were executed. The violence struck directly at the Queen's family. A political rivalry had entered the household. Imagine Elizabeth Woodville receiving the news. No invented words are needed. The material facts are enough. A father killed, a brother killed, her family's rise answered by blood, her husband's kingship challenged by the very men who had helped make it. In court politics, family advancement could bring titles. It could also bring enemies close enough to kill. For Edward, the humiliation was severe. Warwick briefly had the king in his power. The Kingmaker had not merely complained. He had shown that he could still reach the king's body, still disrupt the realm, still make Edward feel the old danger of controlled kingship. But Edward IV was not Henry VI. He recovered. Warwick's attempt to dominate him did not produce a stable alternative government. Edward regained freedom and authority. The rebellion had exposed the fracture, but it had not solved Warwick's problem. The king was still king. The Woodville marriage could not be undone. Clarence had proved himself unreliable, but not yet decisive. So Warwick moved further. By 1470, the Kingmaker had crossed a line that would have seemed almost unthinkable during the early Yorkist struggle. He made common cause with Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian party. The man who had helped overthrow Lancastrian rule now turned toward the woman who had fought to preserve it. This was not because old hatreds vanished. It was because political survival can make enemies useful. Warwick needed a king he could manage, or at least a settlement that restored his position. Margaret needed force, allies, and a way to bring Lancastrian hope back from defeat. Their alliance was unnatural, but not irrational. That made it more disturbing. It revealed how far legitimacy had decayed into instrument. A London citizen watching the badges change might understand the absurdity better than any lord would admit. One year, a man wore Yorkist colours and called Henry VI party enemies of the realm. Later, the same networks might speak of restoring Henry as lawful king. Shop signs did not change as quickly as noble loyalties. Ordinary people had to guess which rose would be safe tomorrow. In 1470, Warwick forced Edward IV into exile. Henry VI was restored. The old Lancastrian king, passive and fragile, was brought back to the throne in what became known as the readeption. But the restoration carried a strange emptiness. Henry VI was king again, yet few could pretend he was the true engine of events. Warwick had made him useful. Margaret and Prince Edward were still central to Lancastrian hopes. Clarence had tied himself to rebellion and ambition. Edward IV waited abroad, not dead, not finished, not the sort of man likely to accept permanent exile. The realm had now witnessed something poisonous. Kings could be made, kings could be unmade, And the man doing it did not even need to change his name. Warwick's career exposed the nightmare at the heart of 15th century English monarchy. If a subject became powerful enough to choose between kings, then kingship itself became conditional. The sacred language remained, the seals remained, the crowns remained, but everyone could see the force behind the curtain. Edward IV had learned that victory at Towton was not enough. A king who wins a civil war must still survive the men who helped him win it. And Warwick had learned something too. If Edward would not be guided, he would be replaced. But there was one problem with replacing Edward IV. Edward was still alive. He was still young, still ambitious, still capable of commanding men. Still the kind of ruler who understood that losing a crown did not mean the story was over. Across the sea, in exile, Edward prepared to return. In the next chapter, the Wars of the Roses will twist into one of their strangest reversals. The Kingmaker will restore the king he once fought, then face the king he failed to control. And at Barnet and Tewkesbury, the politics of betrayal will be paid for in fog, steel, and the near extinction of Lancastrian hope. Henry VI returned to the throne like a man returned to a room that no longer belonged to him. The crown was placed back on a Lancastrian head. The old formulas of kingship were spoken again, and England was told that the proper order had been restored. But anyone watching closely could see the emptiness inside the ceremony. Henry was king again. Warwick had made it happen. That fact poisoned the Restoration from the beginning. The readeption of 1470 was one of the strangest moments in the Wars of the Roses. The same Earl of Warwick who had helped Edward IV rise now helped bring Henry VI back. The same political world that had once described Henry's government as corrupt and failed now dressed his return in the language of legitimacy. It was not that memory had vanished. It was that usefulness had overruled memory. For Warwick, Henry VI was valuable precisely because he was weak. A strong Edward IV had humiliated him, ignored him, married without his approval, promoted the Woodvilles, and proved that a king made by nobles could become a king who ruled without them. Henry, by contrast, offered a softer instrument. A restored Lancastrian monarchy could carry the sacred name of old legitimacy while leaving real influence in the hands of the men who arranged the restoration. For Margaret of Anjou, the alliance was uglier but necessary. Warwick had once been the enemy of her house. His support had helped Edward IV take the crown. His campaigns had helped break Lancastrian power. But politics had narrowed the world. Her son, Prince Edward, still represented the Lancastrian future. And if Warwick's power could help restore that future, old hatred had to be swallowed. That is what civil war does to moral clarity. It makes yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's bridge. In London, people had seen enough reversals to understand caution. A citizen might take one badge from a doorway and replace it with another, not because his heart had changed, but because survival required reading the weather of power. A red rose today, a white rose tomorrow, a cautious face either way. In a city of apprentices, merchants, widows, and guildsmen, ideology mattered less than the question of which army would arrive hungry. The readeption asked England to believe that Henry VI's restoration ended the disorder. But the country had already learned too much. It had learned that kings could be removed. It had learned that parliament and proclamation could follow force. It had learned that the same great lord might serve one king, betray him, and then call the betrayal lawful. No royal ceremony could make that knowledge disappear. And Edward IV was still alive. He had fled to the Burgundian lands, where his connections through his sister Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, gave him room to breathe. Exile could destroy a weak claimant. Edward was not weak. He had lost the kingdom, but not his confidence, not his name, not his military reputation, and not the memory of Towton. In early 1471, Edward returned to England. He did not return at first with the full thunder of a conquering king. He landed in the north with limited forces, moving carefully, presenting himself at first in a way that could appear less threatening. But Edward had one gift that Henry VI did not possess. Momentum could gather around him quickly because men believed he could act. A living warrior king is hard to keep out of a country that has already seen him win. Clarence, Edward's brother, now faced the cost of his ambition. He had joined Warwick. He had married Warwick's daughter. He had imagined that rebellion might lift him into greater power. But rebellion is easier when the outcome is distant. Once Edward returned, Clarence had to decide whether his future lay with the Kingmaker or with his own brother. He returned to Edward. That defection mattered. It weakened Warwick's alignment and reminded everyone that blood could still interrupt faction. But it also showed the unstable morality of the age. Men changed sides with explanations ready: family, self-preservation, fear, ambition. Each could be made to sound like principle if the speaker survived long enough. Warwick now faced the man he had failed to control. The meeting came at Barnet on the 14th of April 1471. The battle was fought in fog. That detail has stayed with the story because it feels almost too fitting. Fog on the field, fog in the loyalties, fog over the old claims of right and wrong. Armies moved under banners that had changed meaning too many times. Men killed for kings whom powerful nobles had treated as replaceable. But Barnet was not a poem. It was confusion, sweat, shouting, metal, bad visibility, and decisions made under pressure. A soldier in that fog might have seen only fragments: a livery badge through grey air, the dark shape of a standard, the sudden panic of men who believed allies were enemies. Accounts of the battle emphasize confusion between Lancastrian forces, including the fatal misrecognition involving the Earl of Oxford's men and Warwick's side. Whether every detail reached us perfectly or not, the larger truth is clear. In the fog, Warwick's coalition broke. Warwick was killed. The Kingmaker died on the field, and with him died the fantasy that one overmighty subject could keep changing kings until the kingdom obeyed his design. Edward IV had survived the man who made him. Barnet restored Edward's immediate authority, but it did not end the Lancastrian cause. On the very day of the battle, or close to it, depending on the sequence of news and arrival, Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward landed in England after years of effort and exile. It was a cruel turn of timing. The Queen returned to fight for her son just as the ally who had made her return politically possible was dead. Still, she did not surrender. There was nowhere safe left in surrender. Prince Edward of Lancaster was now the living heart of the Lancastrian future. If he could join supporters, if he could gather force, if Edward IV could be challenged again, then perhaps the crown could still return permanently to Henry VI's line. The hope was thin, but hope can still move armies when the alternative is extinction. Edward IV moved quickly. He understood what was at stake. Warwick had been a dangerous magnate. Prince Edward was something more dangerous still. A living Lancastrian heir meant that every discontented noble, every exile, every man dispossessed by Yorkist victory could dream of restoration. As long as the prince lived, Edward IV's crown had a rival future. The armies met at Tewkesbury on the 4th May 1471. The battlefield there did not merely decide another round of power. It decided whether Lancaster still had a direct dynastic path forward. The fighting ended in Yorkist victory. The Lancastrian army was defeated. Prince Edward was killed. The heir was gone. No rhetoric can soften the political meaning of that death. For Margaret of Anjou, it was personal ruin. For the Lancastrian cause, it was dynastic catastrophe. The child she had fought to protect, the living answer to Yorkist inheritance, the boy for whom armies had moved and settlements had been rejected, was dead on or after the field of Tewkesbury. A mother's war had reached the place every mother fears. After the battle, some Lancastrian survivors sought sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey. The image is almost unbearable. Sacred space, blood outside, frightened men inside, the old boundary between God's house and political vengeance under pressure. Edward IV's victory had to become more than military success. It had to become a final warning. Defeated men were executed. The Abbey did not erase the logic of victory. Then came the Tower. Henry VI, the restored king who had never truly controlled his restoration, died in the Tower of London shortly after Tewkesbury. Yorkist accounts offered one version. Later writers gave others. Many historians have long suspected that Edward IV's regime had him killed, but the exact details remain impossible to reconstruct with certainty. What can be said safely is this. After Tewkesbury, Henry VI alive was no longer harmless. With Prince Edward dead, Henry had no strong future as an active ruler, but he remained a sacred symbol around which Lancastrian memory could gather. In a world where kings had already been restored from captivity, a living Henry was a risk Edward IV did not need. The old king died in darkness. The Lancastrian direct line had been broken. For Edward IV, 1471 was a year of brutal success. Barnet killed Warwick. Tewkesbury killed Prince Edward. Henry VI's death removed the old king from the political stage. In one campaign, Edward destroyed the Kingmaker, the heir, and the restored symbol of Lancaster. He had done what Towton had not fully done. He had made Yorkist rule look final, but finality in the Wars of the Roses was always deceptive, because each act of removal created silence only on the surface. Underneath remained confiscated lands, frightened families, noble resentments, widows, exiles, and the memory of how quickly fortune could turn. Edward had defeated his enemies, but he had also shown England the method by which problems could be solved. Kill the rival, seize the body, rewrite the law, reward the loyal, punish the defeated. That method worked. That was why it was dangerous. A clerk after Tewkesbury might sit again with parchment and ink, copying attainders, grants, restorations, pardons. The battlefield had ended, but its consequences entered the archive. One man's death became another man's estate. One family's ruin became another family's opportunity. The war continued in documents long after the mud dried. Edward IV now stood stronger than ever. He had the crown. He had killed or neutralized the greatest threats. Warwick was gone. Henry VI was gone. Prince Edward was gone. Margaret of Anjou was captured and broken as a political force. Clarence had returned to obedience, at least for now. The Yorkist king could finally attempt what had been impossible since 1455. Normal rule. For more than a decade after 1471, Edward's kingship would look comparatively stable. The violence did not vanish, but the central crisis seemed contained. The court functioned. The king ruled. Trade, law, patronage, and royal authority began to settle around him. England exhaled, but it did not heal. The deeper problem had never been only Lancaster. It was the way royal blood, noble fear, and armed politics had taught the English elite to imagine alternatives whenever trust failed. Edward could defeat Henry VI. He could defeat Warwick. He could defeat Prince Edward. But he could not easily erase the habit the wars had created. The next danger would not come immediately from a Lancastrian army. It would come from the Yorkist succession itself. Because Edward IV's peace depended heavily on Edward IV being alive, and the king who had survived Towton, exile, Barnet, and Tewkesbury would one day leave behind the most dangerous thing in a realm trained by civil war, a child heir. In the next chapter, the story slows. The battlefield's quiet. The court grows richer. Edward IV seems to have built the peace his enemies could not destroy, but beneath that calm, a question waits like a closed door in the tower. What happens when the warrior king dies before his son is old enough to rule? For a while, England looked calm. That is one of the most deceptive images in the whole story. After Barnet, after Tewkesbury, after the death of Warwick, Prince Edward, and Henry VI, the country seemed to have emerged from the worst of the storm. The old Lancastrian centre had been broken. The Kingmaker was dead. The rival heir was gone. Margaret of Anjou, once the fiercest defender of her son's inheritance, had been reduced from political force to defeated prisoner. Edward IV stood alone. Not alone in the sense of weakness, alone in the sense that no surviving rival could match him directly. He had fought, lost, returned, and won. He had been driven into exile and come back sharper. He had watched the man who made him betray him, then watched that man die on the field at Barnet. He had seen the Lancastrian line bleed out at Tewkesbury. By 1471, Edward did not merely possess the crown. He had survived every man who tried to take it from him. That survival created authority. The second phase of Edward IV's reign, from 1471 to 1483, was not free of tension, but compared with the years before it, it had the feel of restoration. The king ruled. The court functioned. The law moved through familiar channels. Trade resumed its rhythms. Men who wanted advancement came to royal presence, not to a battlefield first. For ordinary people, this mattered. Peace is not always a grand idea. Sometimes it is a road that can be traveled without armed retainers blocking it, a market opening without rumor of confiscation, a merchant counting cloth without wondering which army will requisition it, a household sleeping through the night without hoofbeats outside the gate. In London, a royal officer might sit with accounts and feel the difference in ink. Wages could be entered, customs revenues calculated, grants recorded, petitions processed. The kingdom was not healed in its heart, but the surface of government had become readable again. That was one of Edward's real achievements. He made royal power feel practical. Henry VI had been surrounded by men trying to use kingship because he could not hold it firmly himself. Edward IV made kingship bodily. He was large, visible, charismatic, and capable of decision. He understood appetite, reward, punishment, charm, display, and force. He could be generous. He could be ruthless. He could make men feel seen, and make enemies understand that mercy was not guaranteed. That kind of king can quiet a violent political class, not because everyone loves him, because enough people believe he can win. Edward's second reign depended on that belief. The Yorkist settlement after 1471 was not a machine that could run without him. It was a political arrangement held together by the king's authority. His household, his judgment, his access to patronage, and the memory that he had defeated Warwick and Lancaster when both seemed capable of overturning him. Men adjusted themselves around that fact. Some submitted because they were loyal. Some because they were tired. Some because they had benefited from Yorkist victory. Some because the alternative was exile, attainder, or ruin. Some because, after so many reversals, obedience looked like the safest investment. Edward knew how to make that obedience profitable. He cultivated a more efficient royal household. He watched finances closely by the standards of the age. He used customs revenues, trade connections, and royal lands with increasing care. He did not always need Parliament in the same desperate way weaker kings did, which gave him a degree of independence. Money mattered. The Wars of the Roses were not fought only with claims and banners. They were fought by men who needed wages, estates, offices, debts repaid, and households maintained. A king who could pay, reward, and manage property had a weapon quieter than an army, but often more durable. Edward understood that after years of blood, stability had to be made material. A royal grant could bind a supporter. A pardon could neutralize an enemy. A marriage could place a family inside the Yorkist order. A confiscated estate could turn rebellion into poverty. The archive became the battlefield after the battlefield. And yet, inside this apparent order, old dangers remained. One of them had his own blood. George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's brother, had already proved how dangerous a royal sibling could be. Clarence had joined Warwick, married Warwick's daughter Isabel Neville, flirted with alternative power, and returned to Edward only when the balance shifted. He was not a Lancastrian enemy. He was worse in some ways. He was Yorkist. That meant his ambition came from inside the victorious house. Clarence's position after 1471 remained uneasy. He was too close to the throne to be irrelevant and too unreliable to be trusted. His marriage into the Neville inheritance gave him further interests and quarrels. After Isabel Neville died in 1476, Clarence's behavior grew more erratic and dangerous in the political eyes of the king. By 1478, Edward IV had reached the limit of tolerance. Clarence was accused of treason, condemned by Parliament, and executed. The famous story that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine belongs to the strange half-lit world where political death becomes legend. It should be treated cautiously, as later memory and dark humor wrapped around a real execution. But the fact of Clarence's fall is enough. Edward IV had killed, or allowed the legal killing of, his own brother. That was not a small thing. It revealed the cost of Yorkist order. Edward could impose discipline on his own family, but doing so deepened the habit that royal blood was not protection. A brother could become a traitor. A Duke of Clarence could be processed through Parliament and removed. The family that had fought Lancaster in the name of better rule had learned to police itself with fatal severity. In a quiet room after the sentence, one might imagine not dialogue, but objects. A seal pressed into wax, a document folded, a messenger leaving. A noble household suddenly understanding that the king's patience had ended. The violence did not need a battlefield. It could arrive as legal form. Edward's brother was gone. His other brother remained. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was different from Clarence. He had remained loyal during the crisis with Warwick. He had supported Edward in the north. He had developed a strong power base there, especially through his role in the governance of the northern counties and his association with the Council of the North. To many, Richard looked like the dependable brother, the disciplined servant of the Yorkist crown. That reputation mattered in 1483. For now, it helped Edward. Richard's strength in the north extended royal authority into a region where loyalty could not be assumed. He could handle magnates, border pressures, local disputes, and the rough politics of northern lordship. He was useful because he was powerful. He was dangerous for the same reason. Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, also remained central to the settlement. The Woodville family had survived Warwick's violence and the executions of 1469. Under Edward's protection, they continued to occupy important space around the royal household and the young heirs. Elizabeth was not merely the woman Edward had married. She was the mother of the future king. Her son, Edward, Prince of Wales, was growing up as the center of Yorkist succession. That should have made the realm feel safer. A king with sons is supposed to reassure a dynasty. Edward IV had heirs. He had daughters who could be married into alliances. He had a queen, a household, brothers, a functioning court, and a record of victory. On the surface, the Yorkist future looked more secure than it had ever been. But succession is not secured merely by producing children. It is secured by ensuring that adults agree what those children mean. And around Edward IV's sons stood rival interests. The Woodvilles had every reason to protect their access to the heir. Richard of Gloucester had every reason to fear a Woodville-dominated minority government if Edward died too soon. Other nobles had memories of what happened when a child king became the prize of competing factions. England had already lived through Henry VI's minority. It knew what could happen when the king was too young and the men around him were too ambitious. The nightmare was not theoretical. It was historical memory. Edward IV's second reign therefore contained a hidden contradiction. The more successful he became personally, the more the settlement depended on his continued presence. He could discipline Clarence. He could balance Woodvilles and old Yorkist servants. He could reward Richard without letting him overshadow the heir. He could keep London calm, manage finance, and remind nobles that rebellion had consequences. But he could not rule from the grave. And his physical life, once the source of Yorkist confidence, began to matter almost too much. Edward was still in his 40s when the end approached, but his health had been affected by years of appetite, campaign, and strain. He had been a warrior in youth and a ruler of great physical presence. That presence had political meaning. People had learned to imagine Yorkist stability through his body. The tall king, the victorious king, the man who came back from exile and destroyed Warwick. Then, in April 1483, that body failed. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483. The shock was not only grief. It was structural. His heir, Edward V, was 12 years old. A boy could inherit the title. He could not command the factions that gathered around it. At once, the calm surface of the second reign cracked. The old questions returned in new clothing. Who would control the child king? Would the Woodville family dominate the government through the young Edward? Would Richard of Gloucester, named in effect as protector by political expectation and the logic of his position, accept a limited role? Would the council hold together? Would old Yorkist nobles tolerate the Queen's relatives? Would London accept a smooth coronation before the factions could move? The problem was not that England lacked a king. It had one. The problem was that the king was a child, and every powerful adult near him understood what that meant. Somewhere on the road from Ludlow toward London, young Edward V began his journey to the capital. He was not marching as a conqueror. He was traveling toward coronation. Around him were members of his mother's family and household, men who assumed that proximity to the boy would shape the future government. To the Woodvilles, that closeness was natural. They were the family of the king's mother. They had guarded his upbringing. They had every reason to protect him from enemies who hated their rise. To Richard of Gloucester, it could look like a threat. If the Woodvilles controlled the boy before the protectorate was settled, they might control the reign. And if they controlled the reign, what would happen to the man who was powerful, royal, and potentially inconvenient? This is where Edward IV's peace reveals its weakness. It had suppressed conflict without resolving distrust. The moment the king died, everyone began calculating again. A household servant packing for the young Edward's journey might have noticed only fragments. Chests being closed, horses prepared, messages arriving too quickly, adults lowering their voices when the prince entered. The boy was the center of England, but the decisions were already moving around him. The road to London was not only a route to coronation, it was a corridor of danger. Edward IV had spent more than a decade proving that a strong king could hold the Yorkist order together. His death proved the opposite with brutal speed. The order had not become strong enough to hold itself together without him. For 12 years, the peace had been real enough to live inside, but it had been built on one man's body. Now that body was gone. In the next chapter, the story enters its most claustrophobic phase. No frozen battlefield, no massed armies under snow, no open clash like Towton. Instead, roads, arrests, council chambers, sanctuary locked doors, and the Tower of London. Edward V will travel toward his coronation. Richard of Gloucester will move to intercept the future. And England will discover that the most dangerous struggle for a crown can begin with the promise to protect a child. The boy king was on the road to London. He was 12 years old enough to understand ceremony, perhaps, old enough to know that men bowed differently around him now, old enough to feel the weight of sudden attention, but not old enough to command the armed adults who were already deciding what his kingship would mean before he ever sat beneath the crown. Edward V had inherited England in April 1483. His father, Edward IV, was dead. The man who had held Yorkist peace together through charisma, victory, appetite, calculation, and fear had vanished from the center of power. What remained was not an empty throne exactly. There was an heir. There was a line of succession. There were plans for coronation. But succession on paper is not the same as control in motion. The young Edward had been raised in Ludlow, near the Welsh marches, under the supervision of his maternal relatives and household. Around him stood Woodville influence. His uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, his half-brother Richard Grey, and men connected to the Queen's family. To Elizabeth Woodville, this was natural. Her son was king. Her family had guarded him, served him, and had every reason to keep him safe from those who resented their rise. To Richard, Duke of Gloucester, it could look like something else. A government forming before he could reach it. Richard was Edward IV's surviving brother, loyal through the worst of the Yorkist crises, powerful in the north, respected as a military and regional figure. He was not an outsider claiming sudden relevance. He had served the Yorkist crown for years. He had reason to expect a central role in the minority government of his nephew. The issue was not whether Edward V was king. The issue was who would stand closest to him. That question had already destroyed peace once in Henry VI's reign. England knew the danger of child kings. It knew that a boy on a throne could become the possession of adult factions. It knew that access could become government, and government could become survival. So when Edward V travelled toward London, the road became political. At Stony Stratford, the future narrowed. Richard of Gloucester and Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, intercepted the royal party. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and others close to the boy were arrested. The young king was taken under Richard's control. The official language could still sound protective. Dangerous advisers had been removed. The king would be escorted to London safely. The coronation would proceed. Order would be preserved. But by now, English politics had learned to distrust official language when soldiers stood behind it. For the Woodvilles, the arrests were not neutral. They were a strike at the Queen's family. For Richard, they may have seemed necessary to prevent a Woodville-dominated minority regime. For the boy himself, whatever was explained to him, the material fact was simple. The adults around him changed, and with that change, his kingship changed too. A child can feel power moving even when he cannot name the mechanism. The road to coronation had become a road into custody. In London, Elizabeth Woodville understood the danger quickly enough. She withdrew into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters and her younger son Richard, Duke of York. Sanctuary was not merely a hiding place. It was a religious and legal space, protected by old custom, wrapped in the authority of the church. But sanctuary had limits when politics became desperate. Imagine the Queen inside Westminster. Stone walls, dim religious light, the smell of candle smoke, children nearby, messengers arriving with fragments of news. Her elder son was in Gloucester's hands. Her brother and son from her first marriage had been arrested. The coronation was delayed. The city was filling with rumor. No speech needs to be invented for her. The situation speaks loudly enough. The mother of the king had become a woman bargaining from behind sacred walls. Richard brought Edward V to the Tower of London. That fact alone can mislead modern imagination. The Tower was not only a prison. It was also a royal residence and a traditional place for monarchs to stay before coronation. A boy king entering the Tower before being crowned was not, in itself, proof of murder, imprisonment, or usurpation. At first, the forms could still be maintained. Edward V was in London. The coronation was expected. Richard was protector. The council still existed. The kingdom could pretend that the machinery of monarchy was moving toward a normal outcome. But the machinery kept slowing. The coronation date was postponed. Then postponed again. The delay mattered. Every postponement gave rumor time to grow, and Richard time to consolidate control. Every day the boy remained uncrowned. His kingship remained incomplete in the public imagination. He was Edward V by right of succession, but an uncrowned child in the Tower was politically more vulnerable than a crowned king in Westminster Abbey. Then came Hastings. William Hastings, Lord Hastings, had been a loyal supporter of Edward IV. He was no Woodville partisan, and at first glance he might have seemed a natural ally for Richard against the Queen's family. He disliked Woodville influence and supported Gloucester's initial move to control the minority government. but Hastings was loyal to Edward IV's line. That distinction became fatal. In June 1483, during a council meeting at the Tower, Richard accused Hastings and others of conspiracy. Hastings was summarily executed. The speed shocked political. London. Here was no distant battlefield, no confused skirmish, no armed clash between banners. This was a leading nobleman taken from council politics into immediate death. The message was unmistakable. Richard was no longer only neutralizing the Woodvilles. He was removing obstacles. A clerk near the council chamber might remember smaller details. Voices suddenly raised, footsteps moving too quickly, a door opened, orders given, the scrape of a chair left behind. Then the news spreading outward. Hastings dead. Men who had thought themselves safe because they opposed the Woodvilles now had to reconsider what safety meant. The ground shifted again. After Hastings, the path toward Edward V's coronation grew darker. Richard's actions no longer looked like simple protection of the king from one faction. They looked like a broader seizure of the political field. The question was changing from who would govern for Edward V to whether Edward V would be allowed to govern at all. Then Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince, was brought out of sanctuary and joined his brother in the Tower. Two boys were now inside the same stone world, Edward V and Richard of York, sons of Edward IV, grandsons of Richard, Duke of York, living symbols of the Yorkist future. Children, but not harmless children, because monarchy makes blood dangerous before a child can choose anything for himself. For Richard of Gloucester, their existence was the central problem. As long as Edward V remained legitimate, Richard could at most be protector, regent, uncle, counsellor, or overmighty subject. As long as the younger Richard lived as a recognized prince, there was another heir behind the boy king. To take the crown, Gloucester needed more than custody. He needed an argument. The argument came through legitimacy. Claims emerged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, often connected to allegations of a prior contract involving Eleanor Butler. If Edward IV's marriage was invalid, then his children by Elizabeth were illegitimate. If they were illegitimate, then Edward V was not the rightful king. If Edward V was not the rightful king, then Richard of Gloucester, as the surviving brother of Edward IV, could present himself not as a usurper, but as the lawful heir. This was not merely gossip. It became political machinery. Sermons, public declarations, and later parliamentary confirmation through Titulus Regius would give formal shape to the claim. The language of law and morality was drawn around the act of taking power. The boys were not simply pushed aside by force. They were redefined. That is how legitimacy works when it becomes a weapon. It does not always deny blood. Sometimes it declares the blood unlawful. For the people of London, the shift must have been bewildering and frightening. Only weeks earlier, Edward V had been expected to become king. His coronation was being prepared. Now the city was being told that the children of Edward IV, the victorious Yorkist king, may never have had the right to inherit at all. What is an ordinary person supposed to do with such a reversal? A merchant cannot inspect the private promises of a dead king. A craftsman cannot verify a pre-contract. A widow cannot know what was said years earlier in some private arrangement among nobles. They hear proclamation, sermon, rumor, and counter-rumor. They watch which men carry weapons. They watch who is arrested. They watch who survives. Obedience becomes a calculation made under uncertainty. On the 26th of June 1483, Richard accepted the throne. On the 6th July, he was crowned Richard III. The speed is startling even now. In less than 3 months, England had moved from the death of Edward IV to the expected reign of Edward V, then to the protectorate of Gloucester, the arrest of Woodville men, the Queen in sanctuary, Hastings executed, the princes in the Tower, the illegitimacy of Edward IV's children proclaimed, and Richard III crowned. Every step had an explanation. Together they formed a seizure of power. The difficulty is that historians still debate Richard's intentions. Did he plan from the start to take the crown? Did events push him further than he first intended? Did fear of Woodville domination become ambition? Did ambition dress itself as necessity? The evidence cannot give us a clean window into his private mind. But history does not always require a private confession. The sequence of public actions tells its own story. Richard controlled the king's person. He removed the king's maternal protectors. He delayed the coronation. He executed a powerful man who might resist him. He secured the younger prince. He accepted a legal argument that made both boys illegitimate. Then he took the crown. Whether he began with the end in mind or discovered the end step by step, the result was the same. The protector became king, and the protected disappeared from the center of public life. The princes in the Tower are one of the darkest silences in English history, because the record does not give the kind of certainty people crave. Edward V and his brother were seen less and less. By late 1483, they had vanished from public view. Later accusations, Tudor propaganda, hostile accounts, defenses of Richard, and centuries of argument have crowded around the absence. Were they murdered? Almost certainly many contemporaries came to suspect it. Was Richard responsible? He had the clearest political motive and control of the situation, which is why suspicion has followed him for centuries. But the exact circumstances, timing, and hands involved remain uncertain. The mystery should not be solved by invented certainty. Its power lies partly in the silence. 2 boys entered the Tower as heirs. They left history as a question. For Richard III, that question was fatal even if no court ever judged him. Kingship depends on more than possession. It depends on the ability to make enough people accept that possession without flinching. Richard could be crowned. He could issue orders. He could reward supporters, punish enemies, govern energetically, and claim legality. But the empty space where his nephews had been became a political wound. The Yorkist settlement, already fragile after decades of civil war, now split in a new way. Some men accepted Richard. Some feared him. Some benefited from him. Some recoiled. Some who might have served Edward IV's brother could not forget Edward IV's sons. And outside England, Henry Tudor watched. His claim was weak compared with the great Plantagenet lines. He descended from the Beaufort line, connected to Lancaster, but shadowed by earlier questions of legitimacy. In normal times, he might never have had a chance, but 1483 was not normal. Richard had taken the crown quickly, but speed can leave marks. The Woodvilles were alienated. Some Yorkists were uneasy. Buckingham, who had helped Richard, would soon rebel. Rumors about the princes spread like smoke under a locked door. A weak claimant in exile could become useful if the strong king at home looked morally poisoned. That was Richard's danger. He had solved the immediate problem of control. He had created a larger problem of belief. In the Tower, a key could lock a door. It could not lock the imagination of a kingdom. People could picture the boys. They could picture the uncle. They could picture the coronation. They could picture the gap between protection and possession. The less they knew, the more the silence worked against the king. Richard III had gained a throne. He had not gained peace. In the next chapter, his reign begins under the weight of an absence no ceremony can remove. Buckingham will turn against him. Henry Tudor will become more than an exile, and England will begin to ask whether a king can rule when too many people suspect the road he took to the crown. Richard III was crowned beneath the roof of Westminster Abbey. There were robes, prayers, oil, solemn voices, and all the ancient gestures by which England tried to turn a man into a king. The ceremony mattered. Medieval monarchy lived through ceremony. A coronation did not merely decorate power. It announced that power had entered a sacred order. But ceremony has limits. It can place a crown on a head. It cannot erase the road that led there. On the 6th of July 1483, Richard III became King of England. Only 3 months earlier, his brother Edward IV had died. Only weeks earlier, Edward V had been expected to inherit. The Woodville men had been arrested. Lord Hastings had been executed. The younger prince had been brought from sanctuary. The children of Edward IV had been declared illegitimate. The uncle, who had been protector, had become sovereign. The speed of it all was part of the problem. If Richard had ruled for years as protector, if Edward V had died naturally, if Parliament had slowly worked through a succession crisis, perhaps the realm might have been taught to accept the outcome. But 1483 moved with the pace of emergency. England had barely adjusted to one political reality before another replaced it. A boy king, a protector, a legal challenge, a new king. Too much had happened too fast. Richard's supporters could defend each step. They could argue that the Woodvilles were dangerous, that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid, that illegitimate children could not inherit, that Richard was the adult male of the Yorkist line, that the realm required a strong ruler after decades of civil disorder. These arguments were not meaningless. Richard was not a fool, and he was not merely the theatrical villain later Tudor memory would prefer. He had governed effectively in the north. He had shown loyalty to Edward IV when Clarence and Warwick betrayed him. He had military experience, administrative intelligence, and real support among men who valued his record. But legitimacy is not built only from arguments. It is built from confidence, and Richard's confidence problem stood behind stone walls. The princes in the Tower had disappeared from public view. Edward V and his younger brother Richard were no longer active presences in political life. Whether they were already dead by the time rumors hardened, and exactly how they died if they were murdered, remains one of the great disputed questions of English history. The evidence is incomplete, and later accounts are entangled with propaganda. Yet, politically, uncertainty did not protect Richard. It harmed him. A clear death might have produced grief, suspicion, perhaps rebellion. But an absence created something more durable. It gave every enemy of Richard a silence to fill. It gave anxious Yorkists a reason to hesitate. It gave Henry Tudor's supporters a wound to point toward without needing to prove every detail. In politics, a mystery can be more damaging than a corpse. Richard began his reign under that shadow. At Westminster, the crown glittered. In London streets, people watched. Some accepted, some doubted. Some stayed silent because silence was safer. A merchant did not need to love Richard to obey him. A sheriff did not need certainty to enforce his writs. A noble did not need moral comfort to take advantage of a new regime. But every man had to calculate. That was the dangerous part. A stable king makes loyalty feel ordinary. Richard made loyalty feel like a wager. He moved quickly to govern. He issued grants, rewarded supporters, toured parts of the kingdom, and sought to present his kingship as lawful and energetic. He was not passive. He understood that a crown taken in crisis had to be stabilized through movement, favor, and the visible performance of authority. But speed could not repair trust as quickly as it had seized power. The Woodvilles were alienated. Elizabeth Woodville remained connected to the memory of Edward IV's children, and to the idea that Richard had stolen her son's inheritance. Many southern nobles who had prospered under Edward IV now faced a changed world. Some of Richard's northern allies gained influence, which could alarm men in the south who felt the new king was surrounding himself with outsiders from their point of view. The Yorkist house had not become unified under Richard. It had split around the meaning of his crown. And then came Buckingham. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, had helped Richard in the crisis of 1483. He had stood beside him during the move against the Woodvilles. He had supported the political transformation that brought Richard to the throne. For a moment, Buckingham seemed one of the great beneficiaries of the new regime. Then he turned. The exact motives remain debated. Ambition, disappointment, fear, regional calculation, moral revulsion, private grievance, alliance with anti-Ricardian forces. Historians have weighed them in different ways. It is possible that no single motive explains him. Great men do not always rebel for one clean reason, but the rebellion itself matters more than any perfect psychological answer. In autumn 1483, Buckingham rose against Richard III. The revolt was connected to a wider network of discontent involving southern and western opponents of Richard, Woodville sympathizers, and those willing to look toward Henry Tudor as an alternative. The uprising failed. Bad weather damaged coordination. Buckingham was captured and executed. Richard survived, but survival was not the same as security. A king barely months into his reign had already faced rebellion from a man who helped make him king. That fact cut deeply. It told England that Richard's support was not as solid as the coronation had claimed. It showed that the crisis of 1483 had not ended with the crown changing hands. It had merely moved outward into regional networks, exile politics, and whispered calculations among men wondering whether another reversal might be possible. For a lesser gentleman in the West, Buckingham's rebellion might have felt like a trap laid by history itself. A summons arrives. A lord expects support. Rumors say Henry Tudor may come. Rain turns roads miserable. Horses stumble through mud. Men ask which side will be called treason by Christmas. The decision is not philosophical. It is practical terror. Choose Richard, and perhaps survive if he wins. Choose Buckingham, and perhaps gain if he succeeds. Choose wrong, and the law will arrive later with clean language for dirty consequences. This was the world the Wars of the Roses had made. Rebellion was not only a matter of belief, it was a gamble over which claimant would still be alive when the documents were written. Buckingham lost that gamble. Henry Tudor did not. From exile, Henry had long been a possible Lancastrian figure, but not an overwhelming one. His claim came through the Beaufort line, descended from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, a line once legitimized but barred from succession in the eyes of many by earlier political arrangements. Compared with Edward IV's sons, Richard III, or other Plantagenet descendants, Henry's hereditary claim was thin. In a normal succession, thin claims lose. In a broken succession, they can become useful. Richard's seizure of the throne transformed Henry Tudor's value. Henry did not need to be the strongest blood claimant if he could become the safest political vessel for everyone frightened by Richard. He could attract Lancastrian remnants, Woodville interests, disaffected Yorkists, and men who simply believed Richard's regime was too dangerous or too stained to endure. That was the genius of the Tudor opportunity. Henry could become not merely Lancaster's heir, but the promise of ending the argument. The key was Elizabeth of York. Edward IV's eldest daughter carried Yorkist blood without the immediate problem of the vanished princes. If Henry Tudor promised to marry her, he could present his cause as reconciliation rather than revenge. Lancaster and York, in theory, could be joined. The red and white division could be painted into one future emblem. The idea was politically powerful because it answered fatigue. England had been living for decades under the threat that every royal branch might reopen the war. Henry offered a different story. Not the victory of one rose over the other, but a union that made the old quarrel obsolete. Of course, that was also propaganda. No marriage could resurrect the dead of Towton. No emblem could undo Tewkesbury. No union could erase the Tower. But political symbols do not need to heal every wound honestly. They need to give enough people a reason to stop fighting. Richard understood the threat. After Buckingham's rebellion, he moved to secure his regime more firmly. Lands were confiscated. Rewards were distributed. Parliament in 1484 confirmed his title and the illegitimacy of Edward IV's children through Titulus Regius. The legal machinery tried to make permanent what the crisis of 1483 had produced. Law followed power as it had so often during the wars. But law could not make exile disappear. Henry Tudor remained abroad, first in Brittany, and then increasingly within the orbit of French support. He was a danger precisely because he was outside Richard's reach. A domestic rival could be arrested, attainted, executed, or watched. An exile could wait. He could gather the discontented. He could become a screen onto which frustrated men projected their hopes. Meanwhile, Richard's personal tragedy deepened the political strain. His only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died in 1484. The loss was not only parental grief, it was dynastic damage. Richard, who had taken the crown partly through the argument that he represented the rightful adult continuation of York, now faced his own succession uncertainty. The future narrowed again. Then, in 1485, his wife Anne Neville died. Rumors stirred around Richard's intentions, including talk involving Elizabeth of York, though the details and seriousness of such plans remain debated and must be handled cautiously. What matters politically is that Richard's household no longer radiated dynastic confidence. The king who had taken the crown to secure the realm now struggled to secure his own line. This was not the theatrical justice of a morality play. It was the practical cruelty of dynastic politics. A king without a stable future invites men to imagine another one. By 1485, Henry Tudor's invasion was no longer fantasy. The exiles gathered. French assistance became possible. Men in England watched the weather of loyalty again. The Stanley family, powerful, cautious, and connected by marriage to Henry through Margaret Beaufort, became especially important. Their hesitation would become one of the decisive forces at Bosworth. Richard still had power. He had the crown, the institutions of monarchy, loyal supporters, military capability, and the determination to defend what he had taken. It would be a mistake to imagine him as already defeated. Many kings have survived darker rumors and sharper rebellions. But Richard's weakness was not only military, it was interpretive. Too many people had begun to read his kingship through the same image. Two boys disappearing behind the walls of the tower while their uncle rose to the throne. Whether that image was fair in every detail mattered less than its power. It made every proclamation sound defensive. It made every act of authority carry an aftertaste of suspicion. Richard could punish rebellion. He could not fully command belief. And belief, in the Wars of the Roses, had become the one battlefield no army could occupy for long. In the summer of 1485, Henry Tudor crossed the sea and landed at Milford Haven in Wales. He did not arrive with the strongest claim. He did not arrive with the largest certainty. He arrived with a promise that Richard's England had become too dangerous, too divided, too haunted, and that another ending was possible. At Bosworth, that promise would be tested. Richard III would ride out not merely against an exile, but against every doubt that had gathered around his crown since 1483. The next chapter begins in the haze of late summer, where banners hesitate, allies calculate, and the last Plantagenet king discovers that the most dangerous enemy on a battlefield may be the men waiting to see who wins. The invasion began at the edge of the sea. Not with certainty, not with the thunder of a king returning to his natural inheritance. Henry Tudor did not land in England as the obvious answer to the Wars of the Roses. He landed as a risk carried by ships, exile, calculation, and the hope that Richard III had made enough enemies to turn weakness into opportunity. On the 7th of August 1485, Henry came ashore at Milford Haven in Wales. The place mattered. Wales gave him more than geography. It gave him ancestry, symbolism, and a route into a kingdom where his claim alone would not be enough. Henry's bloodline reached back through the Tudors of Wales and through the Beaufort connection to the Lancastrian inheritance. But by the cold arithmetic of royal descent, his claim was not strong compared with the old Plantagenet lines. Henry did not win because his genealogy was irresistible. He won because Richard's kingship had become resistible. That is the difference. For years, Henry had waited outside England, first under the protection of Brittany, later with French support. Exile can destroy a claimant if memory forgets him. But exile can also preserve him. A man beyond the reach of the king can become a container for other people's dissatisfaction. He can gather promises from those who are not yet ready to rebel openly. He can become more useful as a possibility than he ever was as a person. By 1485, Henry Tudor had become that possibility. To Lancastrian survivors, he was the last practical road back. To some Yorkists disturbed by Richard III, he was a tool to remove a king they no longer trusted. To the Woodville interest and those loyal to Edward IV's children, he could be paired with Elizabeth of York and transformed into a symbol of reconciliation. To ambitious men watching from the edges, he was a wager. Not a certainty, a wager. His army was not overwhelmingly large. His claim was not universally accepted. His future depended on men whose loyalty was careful, conditional, and often hidden until the last possible moment. Every mile inland from Milford Haven required more than marching. It required reading the kingdom's mood. A soldier in Henry's force might have seen the campaign, first, as weather and road, wet ground, salt still in the air from the landing, leather straps cutting into shoulders, the uncertainty of whether the next town would offer food or resistance. The great language of Lancaster and York meant little when a man's stomach was empty, and the local gate ahead might open or stay barred. But Henry's march through Wales and into England gathered momentum. Men joined, others watched. Some waited because waiting was the safest form of politics when the result was not yet clear. Richard, meanwhile, moved to meet the threat with the authority of a reigning king. He had the crown. He had the machinery of government. He had loyal nobles, especially men whose fortunes were bound to his survival. He also had doubt moving beneath him like unstable ground. Richard summoned his forces. John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, stood with him. Other loyalists gathered. The king was not abandoned before the battle. He was not a helpless figure walking into inevitable defeat. He had reason to believe he could crush Henry as an invader and traitor. If Bosworth had been a simple contest of legal right, Richard might have stood stronger. But Bosworth was a contest of confidence, and confidence had become Richard's weakness. The Stanley family embodied that weakness. Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, and his brother William Stanley held considerable power in the northwest and beyond. They had connections that made them difficult to classify neatly. Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, but marriage did not automatically mean rebellion. The Stanleys were careful men in a careful family, skilled at surviving a political age that punished premature loyalty. Richard understood their importance. He also understood their danger. Lord Stanley's son, Lord Strange, was in Richard's hands as a hostage before the battle. A grim reminder that kingship still relied on leverage as much as affection. Richard could command, threaten, and hold hostages. But if a king must force loyalty from men whose support he needs at the decisive moment, something has already gone wrong. The armies came together near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire on the 22nd August 1485. The exact battlefield landscape has been debated and studied, and later memory has shaped the scene. But the political geography is clear enough. Richard stood as king, Henry stood as challenger. The Stanleys stood as the question mark. That question mark may have mattered more than either army wanted to admit. Imagine the field before the decision. Late summer air. Banners moving in the haze, armor catching dull light, men shifting in formation, listening for orders, trying to read signals they cannot fully understand. Somewhere across the field, a standard marks Henry's position. Somewhere else, Richard's white boar badges are visible among men who have chosen, or have not yet dared to unchoose, their king. For an ordinary foot soldier, the great uncertainty of Bosworth was not theology, not lineage, not even the full mystery of the princes. It was whether the men on the hill would move. Armies depend on trust. Not only trust between king and soldier, but trust that the men beside you will fight, that the Lord behind you will not flee, that the banner you follow will not become treason before the sun sets. At Bosworth, that trust was fractured before the first decisive blow. Richard's position was not hopeless. He had military experience. He had courage. He had a royal army. Henry's force was vulnerable. If Richard could strike hard enough, quickly enough, he might kill the invader and end the challenge before hesitation became betrayal. This is why his final charge matters. At some point in the battle, Richard saw an opportunity to attack Henry directly. The details have been retold for centuries, sometimes with drama sharpened beyond certainty. But the essential movement is clear. Richard led a mounted charge toward Henry's position, aiming to cut the rebellion at its head. It was a king's gamble, not a coward's act, not the act of a man already defeated in spirit. Richard III fought with the kind of physical courage that even hostile memory could not easily erase. He was trying to do what warrior kings had always done in moments of crisis: turn personal risk into political salvation. If Henry died, the invasion might collapse. If Henry's standard fell, wavering men might suddenly remember their loyalty to Richard. If the king could reach the challenger, the entire balance of the battle could change. But Bosworth was not only about bravery. It was about who would move when bravery required support. William Stanley's intervention proved decisive. Stanley forces entered the battle against Richard, and the king's charge failed. Richard was surrounded and killed fighting near the center of the crisis he had tried to resolve by force. The last Plantagenet king died on the battlefield. That sentence carries centuries of weight. The Plantagenets had ruled England since the 12th century. Their line had produced Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, John, Edward I, Edward III, Henry V, and all the tangled branches that made the Wars of the Roses possible. They had built law, fought France, lost territories, won legends, created enemies, and filled England with the memory of royal force. At Bosworth, that long story ended in mud, impact, and the failure of men to stand with their king at the decisive moment. After the battle, Richard's body was treated without the full dignity kingship might have claimed. Accounts of the aftermath emphasize humiliation, exposure, and the brutal practicality of regime change. The man who had been anointed king weeks and months before was now proof that God, victory, and political survival had chosen someone else. At least that is how the new regime would want it remembered. Henry Tudor became Henry VII. The crown, according to tradition, was found and placed upon him after the battle. Whether every detail of that image survives exactly as later memory shaped, it matters less than its symbolic power. A crown in the aftermath of battle is not merely an object. It is a verdict written by survivors. But Henry's victory was not inevitable until it happened. That is important. He did not simply arrive as history's chosen founder of the Tudor age. He arrived as a man who could have died in the field, like many failed claimants before him. His claim was weak. His support was conditional. His success depended on timing, foreign backing, English discontent, Stanley calculation, and Richard's damaged legitimacy. Bosworth was not just the triumph of Henry Tudor. It was the collapse of Richard's confidence network. A king can lose because his enemies are strong. He can also lose because too many allies wait too long to prove they are allies. Richard's reign had been haunted by the speed of 1483, the disappearance of the princes, the execution of Hastings, the rebellion of Buckingham, the death of his heir, and the sense that his kingship carried an unanswered question inside it. At Bosworth, those shadows did not swing swords by themselves, but they shaped the willingness of men to risk everything for him. That is how legitimacy becomes material. It becomes a banner that moves or does not move. It becomes a lord who charges or waits. It becomes a soldier who holds formation or looks over his shoulder. When Richard charged toward Henry, he was not only attacking an exile, he was attacking the accumulated doubt of his own reign. And doubt, once it has entered an army, can be as lethal as steel. For the men on the field, the aftermath was immediate. Bodies to strip, horses to catch, wounded men calling through dust and grass, badges that had been dangerous in the morning becoming deadly by afternoon. A white boar emblem could now identify a loser. A Tudor connection could become suddenly valuable. Survival required changing language quickly. Yesterday's king was dead. Today's king needed recognition. Henry understood that the battlefield had given him the crown, but not yet the kingdom. He had won Bosworth. He now had to make the victory look lawful, providential, and permanent. He had to transform a military success into a dynasty. That meant controlling the story. Richard would become the defeated usurper. Henry would become the restorer of peace. The marriage to Elizabeth of York would become the great symbolic answer to the red and white division. Parliament would confirm. Attainders would punish. Rewards would bind. The Tudor regime would begin the careful work of turning a dangerous victory into an official beginning. But the dead do not stop speaking simply because the victor writes first. Richard III's fall left questions that would never fully disappear. The princes remained a mystery. Yorkist blood still existed. Some men who bowed to Henry did so because he had won, not because they loved him. And the habits of civil war, suspicion, claim-making, exile politics, pretenders, calculated loyalty, did not vanish on the 22nd of August, 1485. Bosworth ended Richard III. It did not instantly end the Wars of the Roses. That is why Henry VII's next move mattered so much. He could not merely be another claimant who killed his rival and waited for the next challenger. England had seen too much of that. It had watched kings rise through battle, vanish into captivity, return through betrayal, and fall under new banners. Henry needed a different language. He needed union. He needed Elizabeth of York. He needed the red and white roses to become one image before another army could use them again. In the next chapter, the battlefield quiets, and the painter's brush takes over from the sword. The Tudor rose will bloom from a graveyard of Plantagenet ambition, offering England a symbol of peace that was beautiful, useful, and deeply political. But behind that emblem, the old question still waits. How many royal bodies had to fall before one crown could finally look safe? The Tudor rose was beautiful because it lied so gracefully. Red and white joined into one flower. Lancaster and York fused into a single emblem, a painted answer to 30 years of suspicion, executions, betrayals, battlefield mud, vanished children, and royal bodies carried from the field. It looked like peace. That was the point. After Bosworth, Henry VII understood something that many stronger claimants before him had failed to understand. A crown taken by force does not become safe merely because the rival is dead. Edward IV had learned that. Richard III had learned it too late. Henry had watched, waited, and survived long enough to know that victory needed a story before it could become a dynasty. He had won the field on the 22nd of August, 1485. Now he had to win memory. His blood claim alone was not enough. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, Henry descended from the Beaufort line, connected to John of Gaunt and the Lancastrian inheritance. But the Beaufort claim carried old complications. It was useful, but not overwhelming. Henry could not simply stand before England and say, by blood alone, that every Plantagenet shadow had vanished. There were too many shadows. Yorkist blood still existed. Noble families still remembered who had lost land. Men who bowed at court still measured the new king with cautious eyes. In politics, kneeling is not always believing. So Henry did what successful survivors do. He turned weakness into symbolism. In January 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. The marriage was not just personal, not simply romantic, not merely dynastic decoration. It was statecraft. Through Elizabeth, Henry attached himself to the Yorkist line he had defeated. Through himself, he carried the Lancastrian cause that had nearly vanished. Together, they could be presented as the end of the quarrel. A craftsman painting the new emblem might not know every legal detail of royal descent. He might only see the instruction. Red and white together. The brush moves across cloth or wood. The older colors are not erased exactly, but contained. Two rival images made to obey one design. That is what the Tudor rose did. It did not heal the wounds, it organized them. The emblem was powerful because England was tired. After St. Albans, Wakefield, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, the Tower, Buckingham's Rebellion, and Bosworth, the political class had seen what endless claim-making could do. A country cannot live forever under the fear that every cousin, uncle, child, widow, and exile might become the center of another war. Henry offered an answer simple enough to paint. The red rose and the white rose would no longer face each other across a battlefield. They would bloom from the same stem. But beneath that image lay the harder work of power. Henry VII was not a dreamy reconciler drifting above politics. He was cautious, calculating, watchful, and often severe. He knew that the men who accepted him after Bosworth might accept another claimant if fortune changed. He knew that symbols needed enforcement, so the Tudor settlement combined marriage with control. Parliament recognized his kingship. His reign was dated from the day before Bosworth, making those who fought against him legally vulnerable as traitors. Rewards went to supporters. Punishments fell on enemies. Bonds, recognizances, financial pressure, surveillance of nobles, and careful management of marriages and inheritances became instruments of royal discipline. Henry did not simply end the Wars of the Roses by being gentle. He ended them by making rebellion expensive. That distinction matters. The Tudor myth would later prefer the image of union. Red and white reconciled, the kingdom rescued from chaos, the usurper defeated, the true peace restored. But the actual work of consolidation was colder. A new dynasty, especially one born from battle, must make loyalty feel safer than imagination. And imagination survived. In 1487, only 2 years after Bosworth, Henry faced another Yorkist challenge. Lambert Simnel, a boy presented as Edward, Earl of Warwick, became the center of a rebellion backed by Yorkist interests and foreign support from Ireland and Burgundy. The details of identity and manipulation reveal the strange afterlife of dynastic war. A child could become a claim, even if the child himself was more instrument than author. The rebellion ended at the Battle of Stokefield on the 16th of June 1487. Many historians treat Stoke as the final major battle of the Wars of the Roses. Bosworth killed Richard III, but Stoke showed that Yorkist resistance had not died with him. The old habit remained: find a claimant, gather dissatisfied men, seek foreign aid, test the throne again. Henry won. This time, the victory mattered not only because another rebellion failed, but because the new regime proved it could survive after Bosworth. A dynasty is not founded in one battle. It is founded when it survives the next crisis. Stoke helped Henry become more than the man who had defeated Richard. It helped him become the king who could outlast the Yorkist aftershock. Still, The peace that followed was haunted. The tower remained haunted. The memory of the princes did not disappear. Richard III's reputation would be shaped fiercely by Tudor writers, by hostile accounts, by later defenses, by Shakespeare, by centuries of argument about whether he was monster, victim, ruler, usurper, or some uncomfortable mixture of all four. Henry VI, too, would not vanish. The gentle king who could not hold the realm would be remembered with a kind of holy pity, even as his weakness had helped open the door to violence. Edward IV would remain the brilliant warrior whose settlement could not survive his death. Margaret of Anjou would remain a figure too often simplified, when in truth she had fought for the survival of her son in a world where mercy toward rival heirs was rarely safe. And the princes in the tower would remain the silence at the center of the story. No Tudor rose could cover that completely, because the Wars of the Roses were never only about which house won. They were about what happened to kingship itself when bloodline became a weapon and legitimacy became negotiable. The English crown had survived, but it did not survive unchanged. It emerged more suspicious, more disciplined, more aware that noble power had to be watched, contained, taxed, married, fined, and frightened. The Tudors learned from Plantagenet failure. They learned that too many armed nobles could make a king hostage. They learned that child succession was dangerous. They learned that marriage could be propaganda. They learned that parliament, law, and ceremony could turn battlefield victory into official truth. And they learned, above all, that royal blood was not enough. A throne needs belief around it. The Plantagenets had produced too many believable alternatives. That was their doom. York and Lancaster both carried enough royal blood to make obedience uncertain. Every claimant did not need to be perfect. He only needed enough blood, enough allies, enough grievance, and enough timing. That is how a family destroys itself. Not because every member is uniquely evil, not because one queen is too ambitious, one duke too proud, one king too weak, one uncle too ruthless, or one exile too lucky. Those things matter. People matter. Decisions matter. Henry VI's incapacity mattered. York's claim mattered. Margaret's refusal mattered. Edward IV's marriage mattered. Warwick's betrayal mattered. Richard III's seizure of the throne mattered. Henry Tudor's patience mattered. But beneath all of them was the central fracture. The crown could no longer make the family obey one story, so the family made England pay for many stories at once. At St. Albans, that payment began in the streets. At Towton, it froze into mud and snow. At Barnet, it disappeared into fog. At Tewkesbury, it killed the Lancastrian heir. In the Tower, it swallowed two boys into uncertainty. At Bosworth, it brought down the last Plantagenet king. At Stoke, it flickered once more before the Tudor state finally forced the embers lower. The Tudor rose did not bloom from innocence. It bloomed from exhaustion. That is why it worked. People often obey peace, not because it is pure, but because the alternative has become unbearable. Henry VII understood this. He did not ask England to forget the Wars of the Roses. He gave England an image through which forgetting could become useful. Red and white, one flower, one dynasty, one official ending. But if we return to the first image, two crowns on one stone table, the warning remains. Both crowns had arguments. Both had ancestry. Both had men willing to die beneath their symbols. Both believed themselves lawful enough to make the other side criminal. That was the tragedy. The English royal family did not nearly destroy itself because no one had a right to rule. It nearly destroyed itself because too many people could make the right sound plausible. So the central question returns one last time. What happens when every king believes he deserves the crown? The answer is not only war. The answer is a kingdom where law becomes a weapon, children become threats, brothers become rivals, mothers become commanders, nobles become kingmakers, and victory itself becomes temporary unless someone can turn blood into belief. Henry VII did that. Not perfectly, not kindly, not without fear, but effectively enough to begin a new dynasty from the wreckage of the old one. The Plantagenets left behind more than corpses and legends. They left a warning about power. Inheritance can give a crown a beginning, but it cannot guarantee obedience. A family tree can explain a claim, but it cannot make men trust one another. And when trust dies inside a royal house, the kingdom outside its walls becomes the battlefield. The final image is not a charge at Bosworth. It is quieter. A painter's brush moves across a banner. Red touches white. White folds into red. The flower looks whole from a distance. Beautiful, even. But underneath the paint are older colors, older wounds, older names. And somewhere in the silence behind that emblem, the tower still keeps its question. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us, which dynasty should face the judgment of history next? Subscribe for more stories where history is not treated as a list of dates, but as the autopsy of power, its promises, its masks, its bargains, and the ruins it leaves behind when the story finally breaks.